I have been an apothecary for 40 years, and in 40 years I have dispensed remedies for fevers and fluxes, for melancholy and sleeplessness, for the complaints of the young and the slow deteriorations of the old. But there is one plant I return to more than any other. One plant that appears in every tradition I have studied: Greek, Roman, Persian, Chinese, Islamic, medieval Christian, Ayurvedic, and the folk medicine of a dozen European countries that never spoke to each other but arrived independently at the same conclusions: the rose. Tonight, I want to tell you some things about the rose that you may not know. Before we begin in earnest, a small request. In the manner of the apothecary who asks you to sign the ledger before he opens the good bottles. If you find tonight useful, if Master Aldworth's voice becomes a familiar one you return to on difficult nights, a like on this video, or a subscription to this channel helps more people find their way to this particular shop on this particular street. It costs nothing. It takes a moment, and then we need never mention it again. Now, settle. The rose has a great deal to tell you, and we have the whole night ahead of us. Settle in, then. The candles are burning low, and the shop smells of dried bark and old paper. We have time tonight, you and I, for something wonderful. The rose is older than almost anything you can name. Long before the first human hand ever cupped one, roses were already growing across the northern half of the world. Fossil and evolutionary evidence places their ancestors at somewhere between 23 and 33 million years ago. That is a number worth sitting with. They spread themselves across Europe, North Africa, temperate Asia, and North America. This is why rose lore appears in so many unconnected cultures. The plant was simply there, waiting wherever people arrived to find it. The first people we know of who deliberately cultivated the rose were the Chinese. Records place rose gardens in imperial grounds as far back as 2,700 years before the Common Era. They were grown for medicine, for perfume, and for ceremony, not merely admired, useful. Confucius himself noted that the emperor's gardens were full of roses. The imperial library, he observed, held many books on their cultivation. This tells us something important. The rose was not a passing fancy. It was a subject of serious scholarly attention. By the time of the Han Dynasty, that attention had deepened into something closer to obsession. Imperial libraries accumulated rose treatises. Gardens were cultivated to showcase the finest varieties. The rose was understood as a symbol of longevity, of endurance, of things that persist. It is a fitting association. A plant that has survived 30 million years deserves to stand for something lasting. I sometimes think about the apothecary's relationship with the rose here in this very shop. We keep rose water on the second shelf, dried petals in the left drawer. They have been in use medicinally for longer than any living tradition can trace. That continuity is itself a kind of comfort. What the ancient Chinese understood, and what took much of the Western world far longer to appreciate, is that the rose is not merely decorative. It carries within its petals and hips a genuine medicinal value. But we will come to that. For now, consider simply this. The rose that bloomed in the Han Dynasty garden and the rose that bloomed this morning outside your window share the same deep ancestry. The same wild rootstock, 30 million years in the making. That is where we begin, not with myths or legends, though those will come with deep time and the quiet persistence of something beautiful. Now, there is something the histories rarely pause to mention. Not all roses are equal in their origins. The yellow rose, for instance, did not grow wild in Europe. It simply did not exist there. Every yellow rose that has ever bloomed in a Western garden descends from Chinese species, brought west through centuries of trade and deliberate cultivation. Europe had its reds and pinks and whites. China alone held the gold. When you see a yellow rose today, you are looking at something that traveled a very long way to reach you. The movement of roses was not always peaceful. King Sargon-of-Akkad, ruling in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, returned from a military campaign carrying rose trees among his spoils. Sumerian records from the royal tombs of Ur confirm this. Roses were war prizes, valuable enough to carry home alongside weapons and captured wealth. That detail has always struck me as remarkable. A soldier miles from home, pausing to collect a rose tree. There is something in that image that says more about human nature than any formal history could manage. From those early centers, roses spread in every direction. They traveled to Japan, to the Assyrian Empire, and deep into Persia. Wherever they arrived, they stayed. They embedded themselves in garden culture and poetry as though they had always belonged there. The Persians loved roses with a particular intensity. Their devotion ran so deep that the word for flower and the word for rose became the same word. Gul, a single syllable that collapsed all of flowering creation into one plant. That word survives today as a given name across the Middle East, offered to daughters as a kind of blessing. To be named Gul is to carry the rose with you, always. Across Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, and Egypt, roses were never merely ornamental. They were medicinal, perfumed, ceremonial. They occupied the intersection of beauty and practical use in a way that few plants have managed before or since. The ancients understood, in their thoroughly practical way, that a plant which pleases the senses is often also a plant that heals. The rose was always both things at once. Sappho, the Greek poet of Lesbos, named the rose queen of all flowers. She called it the grace of the earth. This was not casual flattery. Sappho was precise in her language and her thinking. She elevated the rose to the supreme position among ornamental plants, and the ancient world largely agreed with her. The Egyptians bathed in rose water. They scattered rose petals through their rooms to sweeten the air, and they recorded the rose's medicinal uses in the Ebers Papyrus, around 1550 years before the Common Era, where rose oils and ointments appear as established remedies for wounds. Beauty and healing, once again sharing the same page. The Egyptians also placed roses in their tombs. Preserved petals have been recovered from burial sites, placed there with clear intention. Their fragrance was understood to assist the passage of the spirit into the afterlife. The rose did not merely accompany the dead, it guided them. There is something in that which still resonates quietly. We place flowers on graves today without always knowing why. The instinct is older than our reasons for it. Now we come to the mythological heart of the rose. And here the stories grow wonderfully complicated. In ancient Mesopotamia, the rose was sacred to Ishtar. She was the goddess of love and also of war, which tells you something about how the ancients thought about both. The thorn embodied her fierce and protective nature. The petal embodied her tenderness. One flower held both qualities without contradiction. This was not a paradox to the Mesopotamian mind. It was simply truth. Love and war were understood to share the same deep root. The Sumerians held a parallel tradition, their goddess Inanna, whose domain also spanned love, beauty, and martial power, carried the rose as her emblem. Different name, the same understanding. The rose was the symbol that could hold opposing forces without breaking under the weight of either. There is a separate Egyptian thread worth following here. Their folklore held that roses grew from the tears of Isis as she mourned Osiris. This linked the flower not only to love but to grief, resurrection, and transformation. Rose oil was used in mummification, understood to preserve the body and ease the soul's departure. The rose, then, was not merely a symbol of love in the ancient world. It was a symbol of love in its fullest sense, which includes loss. What strikes me, here among my evening jars and ledgers, is how consistently the rose was chosen to represent this particular tension. Not the lily, which tends toward purity, not the poppy, which leans toward sleep. Always the rose, with its beauty inseparable from its capacity to wound. The ancients were not being poetic merely for the pleasure of it. They were being accurate. The Greeks would later develop their own elaborate mythology around the rose's origins. One tradition held that Chloris, goddess of flowers, discovered a lifeless nymph in the forest. Unable to restore her to life, she transformed her instead into a flower. She called upon Aphrodite to give it beauty, Dionysus to add perfume, and the three graces to bestow charm. In this way, the rose was born from collective divine effort, which is perhaps why it has always seemed to carry more than one meaning at once. The rose arrived in this world already complicated. It has stayed that way ever since. The Sumerians did not merely admire Inanna's rose from a respectful distance. They used it actively in ceremony. Temple rituals invoked her blessings through offerings that included roses, petitioned for fertility and prosperity in the same breath. The thorn and the petal were not opposites in these rites. They were a complete statement about how the world works. There is a lesser Sumerian tale that I find particularly striking. It holds that during Inanna's descent into the underworld, she shaped roses from clay with her own hands. The thorns served as protection, guarding her secrets from the demons she passed on her way down. The rose in this story is not decorative, it is armor. I sometimes think of that image when I handle the dried thorn stems here in the shop. There is something in the architecture of a rose that feels deliberate, purposeful. The ancients noticed it too. The Egyptian tradition developed its own relationship with the rose, rooted in a different kind of divinity. There, roses became associated with Isis, goddess of magic, fertility, and motherhood. Red blooms in particular were used in rituals invoking her protection. Tomb art from the 5th century before the Common Era shows roses woven into Isis ceremonies. Petals were scattered after the flooding of the Nile, invoking fertility as the waters receded and the land came back to life. The rose and the flood, the rose and the return of green things, that is a more ancient symbolism than most people realize. There is also a tradition holding that roses grew from the tears of Isis as she mourned Osiris. This places the flower at the intersection of grief and regeneration, which is precisely where the Egyptians understood the most important things in life to reside. Rose oil was used in mummification for this reason, understood to ease the soul's passage and preserve what mattered. The rose, then, has never been simply about love in its pleasant forms. From the very beginning, it was about love in its fullest and most difficult forms, which includes mourning, which includes descent, which includes the patience required to wait for the flood to recede. Now we come to the Greeks, and the story of how the rose got its color. The most widely told version begins with Aphrodite herself. According to this myth, she emerged from the sea foam at her birth, and where the foam touched the shore, white roses grew, pure, unmarked, complete. That was the original rose. The red rose came later. When her beloved Adonis was fatally wounded by a boar, Aphrodite rushed through the forest to reach him. Thorns tore her feet as she ran. Her blood fell on the white roses growing along her path, and they turned crimson. The red rose was born from love and sacrifice simultaneously. It has carried both meanings ever since. There is a version of the story that collapses the two moments into one. Her tears mixed with Adonis's blood where he fell, and together they stained the white roses that surrounded him. The flower thus became a record of two people's grief meeting in the same place. That is a remarkably tender piece of mythology for a culture, not always noted for its tenderness. Another Greek tradition credits Chloris, the goddess of flowers, with creating the rose by a different means entirely. She discovered a beautiful nymph, dead in the forest, and unable to restore her life, transformed her instead into a flower. Chloris then called upon the other gods. Aphrodite gave beauty. Dionysus added fragrance. The three graces bestowed charm, brilliance, and joy. Zephyr, the west wind, blew the clouds aside so Apollo could bathe the new flower in light. The rose in this telling is not born from a single act, but assembled from the gifts of many. It is collaborative in the way that the most beautiful things often are. This is perhaps why no single word has ever quite captured what a rose is. It was built from too many different kinds of wonder. When the Greeks became Romans and their gods changed their names, the stories traveled with them. Flora found the nymph instead of Chloris. Venus gave beauty. Bacchus the sweet fragrance, Mars the thorns. Zephyr still cleared the clouds. The rose remained the same composite creation, just dressed in Roman clothes. What is notable is what Rome added on its own account. Venus, their goddess of love, held the rose as her sacred flower. But the Romans also layered in something the Greeks had touched on only lightly. They understood the rose as a symbol of the painful side of desire. The thorn was not incidental to Venus's rose. It was part of her meaning. Pleasure and pain received from the same stem. The Romans carried this understanding into their treatment of the dead. The festival of Rosalia, sometimes called the Day of Rose Adornment, was celebrated in early summer. Usually in May, graves and memorials were decorated with garlands of roses. The connection was partly the blood and blossom legend of Adonis, whose story the Romans had fully absorbed, but it was also something more straightforward. The rose was understood to belong to both the living and the dead. Its presence at a grave was not morbid. It was a continuation of care. Here in the shop, I keep a small note tucked behind the rose water bottles. It says simply, "For the living and the dead," a reminder of what this flower has always been asked to carry. The Rosalia persisted for centuries and eventually left its traces in Christian practice, as the Day of Roses appears in records from 6th century Gaza, celebrated among mixed Christian and non-Christian populations. The rose moved between religions as easily as it moved between cultures. It was too useful a symbol for any single tradition to keep to itself. What strikes me sitting in this quiet shop with the candles burning low is how little the essential meaning changed across all these different peoples and places. The rose was always about love. It was always about loss. It was always about loss. It was always about the fact that the most beautiful things carry within them the capacity to wound. The ancients did not find this troubling. They found it accurate. The rose and the dead have always understood each other. The Romans formalized this in the Rosalia, their great festival of the departed. Celebrated in early summer, usually through May, the Rosalia saw graves and memorials garlanded with roses. Families returned to burial grounds, not to mourn, but to tend. The roses they brought were understood as resurrection symbols, a promise that what had gone into the ground might rise again in some form. The festival persisted for centuries. By the 6th century, it had blended into Christian observance, celebrated among mixed populations as a Day of Roses. The rose moved between religions as easily as water moves between vessels. It was too ancient and too useful a symbol for any single faith to hold exclusively. There is something clarifying in that. The rose has outlasted every religion that has claimed it. Now let us speak of Eros and the bribe. The Greeks had a story in which Eros, the god of love and son of Aphrodite, wished to protect his mother's reputation. The gods were not always discreet. Aphrodite was frequently less so. Eros approached Hippocrates, god of silence, and offered him a rose in exchange for his secrecy about the indiscretions of the divine. Hippocrates accepted. From that moment, the rose became a symbol of confidentiality. When this story traveled into Roman culture, the custom became architectural. Roses were carved into the ceilings of council chambers, grand dining rooms, and eventually Catholic confessionals. The carved rose overhead meant, "What is spoken here stays here." The Latin phrase sub rosa, under the rose, became a quasi-legal term for information that must be kept in confidence. You can still find stucco roses pressed into the ceilings of old European banquet halls. Silent descendants of that arrangement between a god and a flower. That detail always pleases me when I think of it here in the shop. A symbol of secrecy hiding in plain sight, carved into plaster, centuries old, and most people who walk beneath it have no idea what it means. We have not yet spoken of roses in the Hindu tradition, and that is an omission worth correcting. Hindu sacred lore places the rose at the very origin of the goddess Lakshmi, deity of prosperity, fortune, and beauty. In one telling, a contest arose between Vishnu and Brahma over which flower was most beautiful. Vishnu presented a rose. Brahma named the lotus, but Vishnu's rose carried an argument beyond mere appearance. From its petals, 108 large, 1008 small, he formed Lakshmi herself. The goddess of abundance was shaped from rose petals, as a sculptor shapes clay. The numbers are not arbitrary. 108 is sacred in Hindu cosmology, appearing in the beads of a mala. in the names of deities in the divisions of time. That this number governs the larger petals of Lakshmi's composition suggests the rose was not chosen casually. It was understood to carry divine arithmetic within its bloom. Hindu weddings scatter rose petals as a matter of course, invoking Lakshmi's blessing on the union. Fortune, beauty, and divine favor are requested through the same flower. The tradition continues today, in wedding halls fragrant, with rose water and strewn with petals from varieties that would not look unfamiliar on my own shelves. Now we travel east, and then further east, into Persia and the tradition that perhaps loved the rose most completely of all. Persian gardens were known as paradises, a word that descends from the Avestan parisa, meaning a walled enclosure. These were not merely decorative spaces. They were designed as earthly approximations of heaven, with fountains, fruit trees, and roses featured prominently among both. The rose was not planted for ornament. It was planted as a philosophical statement about beauty and the divine in Sufi tradition. The rose became the central image of the soul's longing for God. The nightingale and the rose, the bulbul and the ghoul, formed perhaps the most enduring poetic pairing in the Persian literary tradition. The nightingale loves the rose with a yearning so complete it cannot be satisfied. The rose remains beautiful and remote. The nightingale sings forever in that gap between desire and fulfillment. Sufi poets use this image to describe the relationship between the human soul and the divine beloved. The nightingale is the mystic, the rose is God, the thorn is the pain of longing that purifies rather than destroys. Fragrance in this tradition was understood to carry spiritual power. The rose's scent was thought capable of inducing trance and opening the mind toward communion with the sacred. There is a Persian legend attached to this that I find particularly beautiful. A nightingale, loving a white rose so fiercely that reason departed, pressed itself against the thorns of the stem. Its breast was pierced, its blood ran down and stained the white petals red, and the rose was transformed by the encounter. The nightingale's song afterward was never quite joyful. It was the song of something that had loved completely and been marked by it. This is why, in the Persian tradition, the nightingale sings at night. It sings in the dark to a flower it cannot see clearly, out of a love that has no practical outcome. And the Sufi poet said, yes, exactly, that is what devotion looks like. There is a second Persian story worth keeping close. The Mughal Empress Nur Jahan, walking in a garden filled with rose petals floating in dew water, noticed a thin film of oil shimmering on the surface. She had, by accident, observed what would become the foundation of a tar distillation, the essential oil of the rose rising naturally to the surface in the warmth of the morning. Whether or not the story is precisely true, it contains a truth of its own. The most valuable things are sometimes discovered by someone paying close attention to something everyone else has walked past without noticing. The Empress stopped. She looked. She smelled the air above the water. And the perfume industry, as we still know it, began in that moment, in a garden in Persia, with a woman and a rose and the quality of her attention. Rumi, the great Persian poet of the 13th century, returned to the nightingale and the rose again and again across his work. For him, the image was not merely literary decoration. It was a precise description of the mystic's condition. The rose is truth, beauty, the divine beloved, present, radiant, and fundamentally unreachable by ordinary means. The nightingale is the seeker, pouring out its longing in the dark. What makes the Sufi use of this image so carefully constructed is its understanding of the thorn. In Persian and Sufi tradition, the thorns of the rose do not simply represent danger or the painful side of romantic love. They represent something more deliberate. The suffering they cause is the suffering of discipline, of purification, of the particular kind of pain that strips away what is unnecessary. The seeker is not wounded accidentally. The seeker approaches willingly, because the fragrance of the rose makes every other direction unthinkable. The rose's scent, in this tradition, was not merely pleasant. It was understood to carry genuine spiritual power. Fragrance was thought capable of inducing states of receptivity, of quieting the ordinary mind, of opening something in the person who breathed it deeply enough. This is why rose water appeared in mosques, in shrines, in the ritual preparation of sacred spaces across the Islamic world. The scent preceded the prayer. It prepared the room for what was to come. Here in the shop, the rose water sits in dark glass on the second shelf. I sometimes open it in the evenings, not for any particular purpose, but because the smell itself is worth the moment it requires. Islamic tradition carries its own sacred rose stories, distinct from the Persian poetic tradition, though the two have long influenced each other. One of the most enduring holds that during the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the Miraj, his ascent through the heavens, drops of sweat fell from him as he traveled upward. Where they touched the earth, roses grew. The scent of a rose, in this telling, is a lingering trace of paradise. When you breathe it in, you are breathing something that does not entirely belong to this world. A gentler story holds that Muhammad wept for his daughter Fatima during her illness. His tears fell to the ground and became roses. This connects the flower directly to paternal love, to grief held alongside tenderness, and to healing. The rose in Islamic tradition is rarely a simple symbol. It tends to carry more than one meaning at once, as it does nearly everywhere. It appears not every rose tradition emerges from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. Let us travel further and attend to what other cultures made of this flower. In Japan, the native wild rose, Rosa rugosa, known locally by its more ancient names, carried associations quite different from the Western tradition of romantic love. Japanese rose lore aligned the flower more closely with cherry blossoms, emphasizing transience. A rose bloomed, and the fact that it would soon be gone was part of what made it worth noticing. This quality of brief, perfect presence appears in classical Japanese poetry as a deliberate virtue, not a reason for sorrow. There is also a Japanese tale of a poor girl who befriended a wild rose growing near her home. She tended it with gentleness when others passed it by. In time, the rose revealed itself to be a spirit in flower's clothing and transformed into a woman who granted the girl a happy life. The story belongs to a broader Japanese tradition of nature spirits rewarding those who pay them proper attention. The rose here is not about love between people. It is about the relationship between a person and the living world. That is a quieter kind of rose story, and I find I am rather fond of it. From Finland comes something stranger still. The Kalevala, the great Finnish epic compiled in the 19th century from much older oral tradition, includes a rose that blooms from the strings of vatimainins. But stranger still is what the hips of that rose contain. They hold within them the songs of creation, the original music by which the world was ordered, and when the rose fruits, those songs become available again, capable of healing rifts in the fabric of things. It is a peculiar and beautiful idea, the rose as a vessel for something that was sung before language existed. The hip as a seed case, not for the next generation of plants, but for the next generation of meaning. Norse tradition, meanwhile, carries the rose into the territory of Freyja, goddess of love, war, and magic. Stories describe her weaving roses into her falcon cloak, the garment that allowed her to travel between the worlds. The hips of those roses were said to fuel her flight between Asgard and Midgard, between the divine realm and the human one. The rose as fuel for traversing impossible distances is not an image I have encountered elsewhere, and I find it lingers. There is also, in Norse symbolism, a rose-like motif that appears around the valknut, a symbol associated with Odin and the slain in battle. Stylized petals ring the knotted triangles. The rose, or something very like it, appears at the threshold between the living and the dead, even in a tradition where the plant itself does not grow natively. Some symbols are so deeply human that they find their way into every mythology, whatever the climate. Poland offers yet another Eden story. In this telling, roses grew without thorns in the Garden of Paradise. They were soft and giving, entirely without defense. When Eve and Adam were expelled, the roses felt the change in the world and grew thorns in response, not as punishment for humanity, but as their own adaptation to a world that had become more difficult. The thorns, in this reading, are not a curse, They are the rose learning how to survive. Patience is what the Polish tradition says the thorn rose teaches. The rose did not abandon its beauty when the world grew harder. It kept both thorn and petal, persistence and grace in the same stem. And that brings us naturally to the Proverbs. Every culture that has grown roses has also grown sayings about them. The English version is perhaps the most familiar, no rose without a thorn. But the Persian tradition offers its own phrasing, equally old and equally true. The thorn comes with the rose. The difference is subtle but real. The English version emphasizes absence and compensation. You cannot have the beauty without also having the difficulty. The Persian version simply states that the two arrive together. One is not a price for the other. They are companions from the start. I keep both versions in mind when I handle the stems here. The thorn is not an apology for the flower. They were always meant to come together. Before we enter the great cathedrals and monastery gardens of the medieval world, let us pause at something older. In the Indo-European strands of folk tradition that predate Christianity by a considerable distance, the rose plant was understood to carry two distinct kinds of meaning, one for each stage of its life. The flower, soft, fragrant, briefly perfect, was associated with maidenhood and the early tenderness of love. The hip that followed, round, red, seed-filled, was associated with fertility, pregnancy, and the mature power of the mother. The same plant, the same bush, was understood to speak differently depending on the season. Spring was one kind of meaning. Autumn was another. The rose was not a single symbol, but a complete life cycle compressed into one stem. Romanian folk custom took this further. The red of the rose hip was understood as a protective force in itself. Hips were included in birthrights worn as amulets by children, carried to guard the vulnerable. The color did not merely signify, it acted. In Slavic tradition more broadly, rose hips were used to protect women and children, and to prevent harm from settling on the young. I keep a few dried hips in a jar on the lower shelf here, alongside the rose water and the dried petals. They have a different kind of quiet than the flowers. They are round and patient, and entirely certain of themselves. Christianity did not invent its relationship with the rose. It inherited one, and then transformed it with considerable care and intelligence. The earliest Christian writers to work seriously with rose imagery were working in the 4th and 5th centuries, when the Church was still negotiating its relationship with the older classical world it had grown from. Ambrose of Milan, the 4th century Church Father, helped establish the image that would govern Marian rose symbolism for over 1,000 years. He argued that roses had grown in Eden originally without thorns. The thorns came after the fall, as part of the world's general hardening. Mary, conceived without original sin, was therefore the rose without thorns. She was Eden restored in a single person. A century after Ambrose, the poet Coelius of Julius developed the comparison further. He wrote a careful theological contrast between Eve and Mary, casting Eve as the thorn, wounding, bringing harm, and Mary as the rose that undid what the thorn had done. This was not mere decoration. It was a structured theological argument expressed through botanical metaphor, and it proved extremely durable. Bernard of Clairvaux, writing in the 12th century, gave this contrast its most precise and memorable form. He distinguished between Mary's virginity, which he associated with the white rose, and her charity, which he associated with the red, and then he set the two women of Christian history directly against each other in language that has been quoted ever since. Eve was the thorn that wounded and brought death to all. Mary was the rose, soothing everyone's hurts, restoring the heritage of salvation. The argument is elegant and the image is exact. The thorn and the rose had always been understood to belong to the same plant. Bernard simply named which woman each represented. What strikes me about this tradition, sitting in this apothecary shop, surrounded by botanical preparations, is how effectively it preserved the older meaning while redirecting it. The rose had always carried the tension between beauty and harm, between tenderness and wounding. Christianity did not discard that tension. It baptized it, turned it toward a new story, and made it speak again with renewed power. The pagan rose of Venus became the Christian rose of Mary. The symbol did not change its essential nature. It changed its address. By the height of the Middle Ages, rose colors had accumulated their own detailed theology. Red roses evoked the blood of Christian martyrs. White roses evoked purity, chastity, and the Immaculate Conception. The 5 petals of the wild rose, the original species form unchanged since before cultivation, were understood to echo the 5 wounds of Christ. Whoever planted that wild rose in a monastery garden was planting a meditation on the Passion. Every petal a wound, the whole flower a resurrection. This is the kind of layered meaning that medieval minds excelled at. Nothing was merely itself, everything pointed toward something else. And the something else pointed toward the divine. In monastery gardens and churchyard borders, roses were planted with deliberate devotional intent. Their presence near shrines and altars was not decorative, it was liturgical. The garden itself became a living image of what theology described in text. Red roses by the altar spoke of sacrifice. White roses by the Lady Chapel spoke of purity. To walk through such a garden was to move through an argument about the nature of grace. I find myself thinking of those monastery gardeners rather often. Men and women who understood that what they grew was a form of prayer. The Gothic cathedrals that rose across Europe from the 12th century onward placed a great circular window, the rose window, at the end of transepts and above main entrances. These windows were explicitly dedicated to the Virgin. Light came through them in colors that medieval glass makers understood as divine. The geometry of the window echoed the geometry of the rose. Folklore grew around them. It was said that praying through a rose window at dawn, when the light first caught the glass, could bring visions. Whether or not anyone actually saw visions is less interesting to me than the fact that people believed the attempt was worth making. The rose window was an architectural statement that the rose and light and Mary and the sacred were all the same thing, approached from different directions. Medieval folk belief also watched the rose as a moral indicator. A rose bush growing near a virtuous woman was understood to bloom abundantly, reliably, as though the goodness of its keeper encouraged it. A rose that wilted or refused to flower near someone signaled something amiss. The plant was not neutral, it responded to character. This seems fanciful until you consider that roses do respond to care, to neglect, to the quality of attention paid to them. The medieval mind simply extended that sensitivity outward, made it a kind of sympathy between plant and person. The rose knew who tended it and reflected what it found. There is a version of that belief I still find useful. Whatever you grow, it will tell you something about how you tend it. The rose does not lie about neglect. It simply stops blooming. The rosary itself carries a trace of this entire history. The name from Physiorosarium, a rose garden, connects a devotional practice to a botanical one. There is a tradition, not universally accepted, but persistently attractive, that the earliest prayer beads were strung from rose hips, that the hips from which rose seeds grow were the original beads on which prayers were counted. If true, it means that one of the most widespread devotional practices in Christian history began in a garden with a handful of autumn fruit and someone who needed something to hold while they prayed. The medieval enclosed garden had a name, the Forti Hortus Conclusus. The closed garden, it appeared in Christian art and devotional writing as a place apart from the ordinary world. Bounded by walls, tended with intention, saturated with symbolic meaning, roses were among its essential inhabitants. They signified paradise itself, that original garden before the fall. They signified protected purity, something beautiful that had been kept safe from the disorder outside the walls. And they signified the contemplative life, the deliberate slowing of attention that made prayer possible. To plant a rose in such a garden was not merely an act of horticulture. It was a statement of aspiration. This ground, these walls, this flower, an attempt at Eden in miniature. Ireland contributes a rose story that belongs to this same tradition of miraculous conversion, though it arrives with a distinctly northern character. In the tale, a pagan chief holds a great hall in midwinter. A thornless rose blooms within it at the moment of Christ's birth. The fragrance fills the hall. The chief cannot account for it and cannot resist it. The rose's perfume does what argument could not. It converts him not through reasoning, but through beauty, through a sensory experience so unexpected and so complete that it opened what nothing else had reached. There is a recurring idea in these miracle stories that beauty operates on a different frequency than argument. The rose does not make a case, it simply exists with such completeness that the observer is changed. Ethiopian Orthodox tradition offers its own version of this sacred presence. Roses are said to have sprung from the ground at the Virgin Mary's footsteps during her flight to Egypt. Wherever she walked, the earth expressed what she carried. These roses became planted near pilgrimage sites, growing at the locations where sacred geography and sacred history overlapped. To visit such a site was to stand where miraculous beauty had first appeared, and to find it still growing there. Let us now follow the rose into the Islamic world, where it was understood with a depth and seriousness that gave it an entirely different life. The damask rose, Rosa damascena, flourished around the city of Tarsif in western Arabia, where the altitude and climate of the Hejaz highlands suited it particularly well. The rose oil produced there became famous across the Islamic world for the quality of its fragrance and for the sacred purposes to which it was put. This was not a decorative use, this was liturgical. Historical sources from the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Ottoman periods describe a ritual perfuming of the Kaaba, the sacred cube at the center of Mecca that is the focal point of Muslim prayer. The blends used for this purpose, called Kaliya or Jailia, combined Tarsif rose oil with musk, ambergris, sandalwood, and saffron. These were not everyday ingredients. They were the most prized aromatic substances known to the medieval world, combined in service of the most sacred space in Islam. The ritual went further still. The Kaaba was washed with water from the Zamzam well, the ancient spring at the heart of Mecca, mixed with rose water. Then it was wiped with cloths that had been perfumed. The rose, in this context, was not ornamentation, it was purification. Its fragrance was understood as a sign of sanctity, applied directly to the holiest structure in the Islamic world. I sometimes think of the apothecary's rose water, sitting quietly on a shelf used for skin complaints and fevered brows, and try to hold in mind that the same flower, prepared in the same basic way, was used to wash the Kaaba. The distance between those two uses is enormous. The plant is identical in the mosques and homes of the medieval Islamic world. Rosewater permeated daily life in ways that made devotion and cleanliness almost indistinguishable from each other. Rosewater was sprinkled on prayer clothes. It was used to welcome guests. It scented the places where people gathered to worship and to eat and to rest. One modern scholar has described it as a prayer in liquid form, something that made the sacred sensory, that allowed piety to be experienced through smell before it was expressed in words. This is a beautiful way to understand it. The mosque smelled of roses. Hospitality smelled of roses. Cleanliness smelled of roses. The rose had been woven so completely into the fabric of sacred life that its fragrance alone could signal something worth reverence is happening here. Turkish custom carried the rose's sacred status into an everyday prohibition. To step on a rose petal was considered a serious transgression, haram, forbidden, because of the belief that roses had grown from drops of the Prophet Muhammad's perspiration during prayer. The flower was not merely associated with the Prophet, it was understood to contain something of him. To treat it carelessly was to treat that presence carelessly. The Islamic learned tradition extended the rose's meaning into ethics and scholarship. The Hadith literature compared a person of knowledge who lives according to what they know to a rose beautiful and genuinely fragrant. The comparison was not with a person who merely appears virtuous from a distance. It was with someone whose inner state and outer expression matched, whose fragrance was real, not performed. A rose does not pretend to smell beautiful. That image sat well with the Islamic intellectual tradition's concern for sincerity. Knowledge that is not lived is empty. A beautiful appearance without genuine interior substance is counterfeit. The rose, because it cannot perform a fragrance it does not possess, became the standard against which authentic learning and authentic virtue were measured. The great Persian poets of the Islamic world deepened this further still. Sadai titled one of his most celebrated works the Gulistan, the rose garden framing his collection of moral wisdom as paths through a fragrant enclosure. He opened it with a reflection on impermanence. Roses bloom, and their season ends, and this is precisely why each bloom deserves attention while it lasts. Transience in Islamic aesthetic philosophy does not diminish beauty, it concentrates it. Rumi pushed the paradox further. He wrote that the rose's rarest essence lives in the thorn, not alongside the thorn, not despite the thorn. In it, the discipline, the difficulty, the encounter with what wounds. These are not obstacles to the rose's fragrance. They are part of its production. Here, sitting in a quiet shop with dried petals and rose water within arm's reach, that seems to me not a poet's conceit, but a botanical observation. The rose does not apologize for its thorns. It grows them as deliberately as it grows its fragrance, and the two have never been separable. We have moved through ancient gardens and sacred fires, through mosque and monastery, through the poetry of longing and the theology of thorns. Now let us step into a stranger room. The alchemist's workshop, the candlelit chamber of the esoteric brotherhoods, the hidden libraries of the Renaissance. The rose did not remain confined to gardens and churches. It followed human curiosity, wherever that curiosity bent toward the concealed and the transformative. And in the world of alchemy and esoteric symbolism, it found perhaps its most elaborate second life. We have already spoken of Sub Rosa, the rose as guardian of secrets, carved above council tables and Catholic confessionals. In the Renaissance, this custom deepened and formalized. Guild chambers, council rooms, and the meeting halls of learned societies throughout Europe kept the convention alive. Roses were worked into ceiling plaster, painted above thresholds, incised into the stone of archways. Anyone who entered beneath them was understood to be bound by an implicit oath. What was spoken under the rose stayed under the rose. In an age when intellectual and spiritual exploration could still attract dangerous attention, this was not a merely decorative convention, it was a practical one. The alchemists, those patient, systematic, often mystical investigators of matter and spirit, found in the rose a symbol precise enough to carry their most complex ideas. The rose was not merely beautiful to them, it was structurally meaningful. In alchemical emblems, a rose shown fully opened at the center of a cross or mandala represented the philosopher's stone in its completed state. The perfected soul, the great work achieved. The petals unfolding outward from a central point echoed the alchemical imagination of a substance expanding from concentrated essence into radiant wholeness. The rose did not simply represent completion, it demonstrated it. In the language of plant geometry, one specific image recurred across alchemical manuscripts, a red rose emerging from a golden cross. The red stood for sulfur, understood as the principle of the soul, of heat, of volatility. The gold of the cross stood for the purified mercury, the spirit made stable. The rose emerging from the cross was the union of these two principles into the philosopher's stone itself. The great work encoded in a single image. The alchemist who drew this emblem was not drawing a flower. He was drawing a diagram of transformation. Into this world, in the early 17th century, came a series of remarkable documents that shook the learned communities of Europe. The Rosicrucian manifestos, appearing anonymously in Germany between Feetwein announced the existence of a secret brotherhood of alchemists and sages who possessed ancient wisdom and intended to transform the arts, sciences, and spiritual life of Europe. The documents caused immediate and widespread excitement. Within a few years, hundreds of pamphlets had been written in response. The symbol these manifestos were associated with was the rosy cross, a rose placed at the intersection of a cross's arms or blooming from its center. The cross represented sacrifice, suffering, and the material world endured with patience. The rose represented enlightened love, spiritual awakening, and the life that emerges from that endurance. Together they encoded a theology of resurrection, the cross as the dark night, the rose as the dawn that follows. Martin Luther, a century earlier, had chosen exactly this symbol for his personal seal, a 5-petaled white rose enclosing a red heart with a simple cross at its center. Whether the Rosicrucians drew directly from Luther's seal or from older currents of symbolism remains debated. What is clear is that the rose and cross image was already charged with layered meaning before the manifestos gave it a new institutional home. The Rosicrucian rose, as it developed through successive esoteric orders, acquired extraordinary complexity. In the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which flourished in late 19th century England and included among its members figures such as William Butler Yeats, the rosy cross became a device of almost encyclopedic density. The rose's petals, 22 in number, corresponded to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 paths on the Kabbalistic tree of life. The innermost tier of 3 petals represented the 3 alchemical principles: salt, mercury, and sulfur. The 7 petals of the middle tier corresponded to the 7 classical planets. The 12 outer petals map the signs of the zodiac. 1 flower, 1 image, containing in the arrangement of its petals an entire cosmology. This connects directly to the Kabbalistic tradition, where the rose carried its own distinct symbolic weight. The rose of Sharon, mentioned in Hebrew scripture, was understood by Kabbalistic interpreters as an image of the divine feminine, the Shekinah, the indwelling presence of God. The layered petals of the rose mirrored the Sephirot, the 10 emanations or divine attributes of the Kabbalistic tree of life, unfolding outward from the infinite source, like petals from a center. The image is precise. A rose does not open all at once. It unfolds gradually, layer by layer, from within. The Kabbalists found in this a model for how divine reality reveals itself, not in a single disclosure, but in successive layers of emergence, each one more exposed than the last. Standing in this apothecary shop, with its jars and preparations and the occasional well-thumbed treatise on the upper shelf, I find myself thinking of those alchemical engravers, men who spent weeks on a single image, layering meaning into the curve of a petal, the position of a stem. They were not decorating their manuscripts. They were writing in a language that required patience to read. The later esoteric traditions, the Rosicrucian orders of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Golden Dawn, and the various currents that flowed from them, all continued to use the rose as a primary symbol precisely because it could hold so much without collapsing. The cross could be a single thing, the circle could be a single thing, but the rose, with its layers and its center, and its thorns and its fragrance and its colors, could be a library. There is a book on the upper shelf here that I return to more than most. It is a translation of the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, that great allegorical poem of 13th century France. 2 poets wrote it across 2 generations. Guillaume de Loris began it around Fritti, and Jean de Meun completed it some 40 years later, adding considerably to both its length and its arguments. The result is one of the most influential poems the Middle Ages produced. The poem structure is simple enough in summary. A young man dreams of a walled garden. Inside the garden is a rosebud. The entire poem is his attempt to reach it. But the rose, of course, is not merely a flower. It is the beloved, the ideal woman of courtly love tradition, kept behind walls, tended by allegorical guardians with names like danger, shame, and fair welcome. The rose cannot be seized. It can only be approached slowly, correctly, with demonstrated virtue. To win the rose was the phrase medieval courtly poetry used for winning a woman's love. The 2 things had become so thoroughly synonymous that poets could use either and be understood perfectly. The rose was the word for the beloved, for idealized love, for something beautiful that required patience and worthiness to approach. Chaucer translated parts of the Roman de la Rose into English. Dante read it. Its influence reached across European literature. For 2 centuries, a single poem about a man in a garden dreaming of a flower reshaped how educated Europeans thought and wrote about love. Dante himself gave the rose its most celestial appearance in the Paradiso, the final canticle of the Divine Comedy. He arrives at the highest heaven and is shown the community of the blessed. They are arranged in the petals of an enormous white rose, a flower so vast that its center is filled with golden light, and the souls within it are like bees moving among petals too numerous to count. The mystic rose, not a symbol of romantic longing here, but of perfected divine love. The rose that had stood for the beloved lady in the garden of courtly allegory was elevated into a vision of what all love is ultimately reaching toward. Dante placed Mary at the highest petal. The flower was hers, and every soul within it had arrived through some form of love, purified by the long journey from desire to grace. It is a remarkable transformation to trace, from Sappho naming it Queen of Flowers, to the garden of the Roman de la Rose, to a rose the size of a universe containing all the righteous dead. The flower carried the weight of that journey without collapsing under it. Robert Burns brought the rose back to earth and footy with a simplicity that has proved equally durable. His red rose, newly sprung in June, compared to his love, is not allegorical, not mystical, not symbolic in any complicated sense. It is simply direct, a real flower, observed in real summer light, used as the most natural available comparison for something he could not otherwise adequately say. Bob Dylan once identified Burns's poem as the single greatest influence on his own songwriting. That is a long line of descent from a Scottish poet writing in Scots dialect in the 18th century to the 20th century's most celebrated songwriter, and the rose is what connects them both. William Butler Yeats used the rose differently, and with considerably more deliberate symbolic weight. His early collection, The Rose, and the poem called The Secret Rose, cast the flower as an emblem of Ireland itself, its ancient beauty, its mystical tradition, its quality of being always just beyond reach of ordinary comprehension. The rose in Yeats is Ireland, as it might be, as it once was, as it perhaps exists, in some register that the political present cannot access. He was also drawing on the Rosicrucian tradition he had studied through the Golden Dawn. The Secret Rose was esoteric and nationalist simultaneously, a symbol doing two different kinds of work at once, and doing both convincingly. Rainer, Maria Rilke, the German language poet writing at the turn of the 20th century, found in the rose something closer to a paradox than a symbol. He wrote about roses repeatedly across his career, but it is his self-composed epitaph that stays longest in the mind. He asked that it read, "Rose, oh pure contradiction, desire to be no one's sleep beneath so many lids." The image is dense and deliberately difficult. The rose, with its many layered petals, resembles closed eyelids. It suggests sleep, but it is also the flower of desire. It is beautiful and self-contradictory, present and concealed, the same as it always was, and always slightly beyond interpretation. Rilke did not want to resolve the rose into a meaning. He wanted to die inside the question it posed. He died, in fact, from a wound caused by a rose thorn, a cut that led to blood poisoning. Whether or not one finds that poetically appropriate, it is at minimum a fact that would have interested him. Oscar Wilde turned the rose toward darker purposes, his Salome. The biblical daughter of Herodias, reimagined in his Hindy play as a figure of terrible consuming desire, speaks of Jochanan's head as though it were a flower. She is drawn to him with a complete, annihilating attention. The nightingale gave the rose in the Persian tradition, but in Wilde's version the love is fatal, possessive, and ends in death. The rose's ancient connection to sacrifice and blood is fully realized, stripped of any redemptive framing. Beauty here is not purifying, it is consuming. Wilde used the rose's oldest associations, love, sacrifice, blood, but reversed their moral charge. The Persian ghazal tradition maintained its own rose relationship across all of this. In the ghazal, the beloved's cheeks were roses. The poet's tears were dew. The images were so thoroughly formalized that a master of the form could work with them the way a musician works with a familiar scale, not to produce novelty, but depth. The rose's unattainability was the point. The poet did not expect to possess the beloved any more than the nightingale expected the rose to descend to its level. The distance was the subject. The Arthurian material adds its own thread. Merlin was said in some tellings to have enchanted a rose garden where the thorns would part only for knights of genuine heart. Those with false intent found the way impassable. The thorns knew. They were moral, not merely physical, a garden that read the character of whoever entered it. What grew inside was neither won by force nor taken by cleverness. It required only sincerity, which the rose had always required. The Victorians inherited centuries of rose symbolism and organized it into a system. They called it floriography, the language of flowers, and they pursued it with the same passionate thoroughness they brought to natural history, manners, and the cataloguing of everything that could be catalogued. The impulse behind it was practical in a particular Victorian way. Rigid social etiquette restrained direct emotional expression at almost every turn. A gentleman could not simply tell a woman he loved her. A woman could not easily declare her feelings to a man she had not been properly introduced to. But a bouquet could speak freely. A carefully composed arrangement could say what a conversation was not permitted to say. The rose was at the center of this language, as it had been at the center of every language flowers had been asked to speak. Red roses meant passionate love. This was the oldest and most durable meaning, reaching back through Burns and Shakespeare to Aphrodite's blood on the thorns. White roses meant purity and innocence. Pink roses expressed gratitude or admiration, a warmer sentiment than friendship, but a more contained one than love. Yellow roses, in the Victorian reading, signified friendship, though in some later traditions they tilted toward jealousy, which shows how these meanings were never fully stable, always subject to local interpretation and the preferences of individual senders. The system went considerably further than color. A thornless rose carried the meaning of love at first sight, the suggestion being that this particular love had not yet encountered difficulty, had not yet learned what the thorns meant. A rose with a broken stem was more sobering. It signified a lesson learned through infidelity. The stem, once whole, now wasn't. Neither was whatever it had represented. A single white rose, sent alone, could express trust and peace, a quiet statement rather than a passionate declaration. A bouquet of more than 5 white roses signified everlasting love, the number amplifying the sincerity. A rose left to wither in a vase was a farewell, or a rejection expressed without the cruelty of words, a fresh rosebud promised. Hope, new attachment, something not yet fully open. I think of the apothecary's relationship with flowers as something adjacent to all this. We have always known that different preparations carry different charges, different intentions. The Victorians simply formalized a version of that knowledge for social rather than medicinal use. The ancient sub-rosa tradition threaded its way into Victorian floriography as well. A bouquet could signal confidence is not to be repeated. A rose included among other flowers could mean, keep what I am about to tell you close. The idea that the rose guard's secrets was old enough by the 19th century to feel less like a convention and more like a fact of the flower's nature. The rose's role in English heraldry is one of the most dramatic transformations a flower has ever undergone. What began as 2 noble houses choosing rose emblems ended in a civil war, a dynasty, and a national symbol that persists to this day. The House of Lancaster claimed the red rose. The House of York claimed the white. The conflict between them, fought across England in the second half of the 15th century, became known as the Wars of the Roses, a name that makes the flower sound more peaceful than the actual events warranted. When Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in Fritty and married Elizabeth of York, the political solution was botanical. The Tudor rose combined the red and the white into a single emblem, a layered flower showing both colors, a visual argument that the 2 houses were now one dynasty. The merger of roses stood for the merger of claims, the end of conflict, the beginning of stability. It is a remarkable piece of political design. The Tudors governed partly through symbols, and the Tudor rose was among their most effective. It appeared on buildings, manuscripts, coins, and cloth. It remains in use today in English royal heraldry, 5 centuries after the marriage that created it. Yorkshire still carries the white rose on its county flag and in its county identity. In local custom, presenting someone from Yorkshire with a white rose is understood as a gesture of recognition, an acknowledgement of where they come from and what that means. A flower that was once a symbol of a dynasty's military claim has become, over 5 centuries, simply a way of saying I see you, I know your home in Irish and British folklore. A rose blooming out of season carried its own weight of meaning. A rose appearing at Christmas, or in the depths of winter, when no rose should be capable of flowering, was read as a sign of otherworldly presence or an approaching change in fortune. The natural order had been interrupted. Something was announcing itself that the ordinary calendar could not account for. The rose, which had always occupied the boundary between the earthly and the sacred, was simply doing what it had always done, appearing where it was not expected, carrying news from somewhere else. We have spent considerable time with the rose as symbol, as myth, as theology, as poetry. Now let us come back to the plant itself, to soil and root and cutting, to the patient, practical work of growing things. Because the history of rose cultivation is as remarkable as anything the poets have made of the flower. The roses that fill modern gardens and florist shops descend from a long, complicated conversation between different species, carried on across centuries and continents with varying degrees of intention. The most important early division is between the old European roses and what eventually arrived from China. Until the late 18th century, European rose growers worked primarily with Rosa gallica, Rosa damascena, and a handful of related species. These produced beautiful flowers. They were fragrant, often richly colored, sometimes remontant, capable of a second flush of bloom in autumn. But most European roses flowered only once per season, in early summer, and then were done until the following year. This seemed until China changed everything. Simply the nature of roses. The damask rose, Rosa damascena, was almost certainly the product of natural hybridization somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, likely between Rosa gallica and the musk Rosa moscatata, with additional contribution from Rosa fecuncoana, a hardy Central Asian species whose most important gift was the ability to flower more than once a season. The damask rose inherited traces of that gift. Some damask varieties produced a second modest flowering in autumn, which made them especially prized among gardeners who had grown accustomed to the single brief summer bloom of other European species. Its fragrance was, and remains, extraordinary. The damask rose became the foundation of the rose oil industry in Persia, Syria, and later Bulgaria. Every major tradition of rose perfumery runs through this one plant. Now let us speak of the apothecary's rose, because in this shop it deserves particular attention. Rosa gallica, officinalis, the officinal rose, the apothecary's rose, is one of the oldest named cultivars in European horticulture. The word officinalis in a plant's name has always meant the same thing. This is the form kept in the apothecary's store. It signals official medicinal use, the form recognized by pharmacopoeias and physic gardens as the legitimate preparation. This crimson semi-double rose was cultivated in monastic gardens across medieval Europe, specifically for its petals, which were dried and made into syrups for treating fevers and intestinal complaints. The petals retained their scent and astringent properties well when dried, a practical virtue that made them useful across long winters when fresh botanicals were unavailable. They were pressed into conserves, steeped into waters, combined with honey and vinegar into preparations that monastery infirmaries dispensed with confidence. It was the same rose, with its deep red petals and its medicinal reputation, that the House of Lancaster chose as its emblem during the Wars of the Roses. A flower that had spent centuries in physic gardens and monastery borders became, in the 15th century, a symbol of dynastic claim, heraldry and herbal medicine sharing the same stem. That is perhaps the most apothecary, appropriate fact about roses that I know. The medieval town of Provins in northern France built something remarkable around the apothecary's rose. An entire local economy. The rose likely arrived in Provins with returning crusaders in the 13th century, carried from the Middle East as one of the more valuable things a soldier could bring home. Within a generation or two, the town had become the center of a specialized rose trade. Rose fairs at Provins drew merchants from across Europe. They came to purchase preserved rose petals, rose syrups, rose petal jams, and dried preparations made from the local crop. These were not purely medicinal goods. They were luxury items, expensive aromatic preserves that traveled well and kept their quality over long journeys. The town's economy rose and fell with the rose harvest for several centuries. It is a reminder that the history of plants is also always a history of economics. Turkey's Isparta province carries that same relationship between a city and a rose into the modern era, though its origins are more recent than people often assume. In the SAA merchant, named Mimft Seyd Gozay Diocese Mail, Effendi traveled to the Rose Valley of Bulgaria and returned to Isparta carrying rose cuttings, reportedly concealed inside the hollow pole of his walking cane, since taking plant material across borders was not always straightforward. He planted those cuttings in Isparta's soil, learned distillation techniques from his Bulgarian connections, and after several difficult years of trial and failure, produced the first Isparta rose oil in Hunt. Sultan Abdülhamit II later encouraged rose cultivation across Ottoman lands by distributing rose saplings and copper stills to farmers. Isparta and Burja proved the most suitable regions. Today, Isparta produces approximately 65% of the world's rose oil. Over 12,000 farming families cultivate damask roses across roughly 25,000 hectares. The harvest follows a discipline that has not changed in its essentials since Ismail Effendi's time. Pickers rise before dawn, often by 5 in the morning, because the oil content of Rosa Damascena petals is highest in the cool hours, just after they open, before the warmth of the day begins to volatilize the most delicate aromatic compounds. Each picker can gather 50 to 60 kilograms of petals by hand in a single morning. The petals must reach the distillery quickly, because the chemistry that makes rose oil valuable begins to shift the moment the petals are separated from the stem. At peak season, the Ottomans called it Doric, the crest. The copper stills run without stopping for days. Workers sleep in shifts. The nights around Isparta are described as festive during harvest, the air saturated with fragrance. Every family involved in some part of the chain from field to flask. 1 kilogram of rose oil requires approximately 4,000 kilograms of fresh petals to produce. The oil, when it finally rises to the surface of the condensed distillate and is separated into its own vessel, is worth its weight in gold on the international perfume market. France, which considers itself the world's fragrance capital, is Isparta's largest customer. Now let us return to Europe and to the revolution that came quietly from China. When the first repeat flowering Chinese roses arrived in Europe via the East India Company's trade routes in the late 18th century, they caused something close to astonishment among those who understood what they were seeing. European gardeners had always known that summer blooming was the rose's single season. A rose that bloomed again in autumn was unusual. A rose that bloomed in waves from spring until hard frost was something else entirely. Rosa chinensis varieties had been cultivated in Chinese imperial gardens for over 2,000 years before Europe encountered them. Their repeat flowering ability, what botanists call remontancy, came from a mutation that the Chinese had preserved and developed through centuries of selection. When those roses finally reached European hands, the breeding possibilities multiplied immediately. Empress Josephine of France understood this before most. At her garden at Malmaison, she assembled the largest and most varied rose collection of her era, including the new Chinese introductions. She employed the botanist Andrew Dupont to manage the collection and conduct hybridization experiments. Malmaison became the center of European rose breeding, and the roses raised there helped establish the lineages that led directly to modern varieties. One important early American contribution came from John Champney of South Carolina, who around Findley crossed a Chinese repeat. Blooming rose with a musk climber and produced Champney's pink cluster, a rose that combined both parents' best qualities and became the foundation of the noisette class. One of the first genuinely American rose contributions to the global breeding story, the hinge year in rose history, is Tien dined. That year, the French nurseryman, Jean-Baptiste Guillot, introduced a rose he called La France, a silvery pink flower of elegant, high-scented form, combining the perpetual flowering quality of the Chinese lineage with the size, fragrance, and vigor of the best European varieties. It was declared the first hybrid tea rose, and everything that had come before was reclassified as old roses by the convention it established. Modern roses were born in 50. Before that date, old roses. After, modern. Among the roses that followed, one stands apart in the weight of meaning attached to it. The variety known as Peace was bred by Francis Meland in France in the late 40s, as the world moved toward its second catastrophic war. Cuttings were sent to growers in several countries before France was occupied, and the variety was developed simultaneously under different names in different places. When the war ended, the International Rose Conference chose the name Peace officially. Its yellow-edged pink petals, large and warmly colored, were offered to delegates at the United Nations inaugural conference as a symbol of what the world was attempting to build. Heritage rose societies today work to preserve the old varieties. The Gallicas, the Damasks, the Albas, the Mosses that existed before Fronti. These are not merely horticultural curiosities. Old roses tend to be significantly more disease-resistant than modern hybrids, which were bred primarily for bloom quality and often sacrifice natural vigor in the process. They carry heavier thorns, their hips are larger and more nutritionally rich. They are, in many ways, closer to what a rose actually is. Before 2 centuries of breeding optimized it for the cut flower trade. A cutting taken from an old rose today is, in the most literal sense, a living link to a plant that grew in a medieval physic garden. The rose has not forgotten what it was. This is the part of the rose's history that sits closest to home, here in this shop. The monasteries of medieval Europe were, among other things, the apothecaries of their communities. Every significant house kept a physic garden, the herbularius, located near the infirmary so that fresh preparations could be made quickly when needed. The garden was not decorative. It was functional infrastructure, as essential to the monastery as the kitchen or the brewery. And in those gardens, occupying a dedicated bed among the sage and fennel and mint, were roses. The most important surviving record of what a medieval physic garden should contain is the plan of St. Gall, drawn around 52 on 5 pieces of parchment stitched together, the oldest significant architectural drawing to survive from the early medieval period. It describes an entire ideal Benedictine monastery, buildings, kitchens, animal pens, guest quarters, workshops, and gardens. The physic garden in the plan contains 16 rectangular beds, each devoted to a single plant, roses among them, alongside sage, fennel, iris, lily, lovage, mint, rue, and rosemary. The rose is listed not as a garden ornament, but as a medicinal resource, grouped with the plants the monastery physician would reach for when treating the sick. The plan also includes a dedicated bloodletting house, a room specifically for that procedure, separate from the infirmary proper. This is where the rose thorn enters an unexpected chapter of its history. Rose thorns were among the instruments used in monastic bloodletting practice. Every part of the plant was considered available to the healer's art. The flower, the petal, the hip, the thorn. Nothing wasted. Monastic herbals assigned responsibilities clearly. At least one brother in each house was expected to have thorough knowledge of the rose's medicinal virtues and its preparation. He would have known which petals to harvest and when, early morning before the heat of the day began to volatilize the oils, and how to dry them without losing their astringent properties. He would have made petal syrups for fevers, rose oils for skin conditions, nosegays of dried petals and herbs for masking the miasmas that rose from the sick. The belief at the time was that foul air carried disease. Fragrant air resisted it. A nosegay pressed to the face was both comfort and, in this understanding, a practical prophylactic. The preparations produced in these monasteries were recognizable to any working apothecary of my own era. Rose water for cleansing and toning. Rose-infused oil for rubbing into painful joints. Conserve of rose petals, petals beaten with sugar into a preserve for soothing the throat and gut. Rose honey, made by steeping petals in warm honey. For wounds that required both sweetness and antiseptic property. These were not experimental remedies. They were standardized treatments, passed between houses through copied herbals and visiting monks who carried seeds and cuttings and knowledge across borders. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess, visionary, composer, and natural philosopher, left behind a medical text called the Physica that treats the rose with the same brisk confidence she brings to everything. She wrote that the rose is cold and that this coldness contains a useful moderation. She recommended placing a rose petal on the eyes at dawn to draw out humor and clear the sight. She prescribed rose petals over small ulcers to pull out the moisture causing them for a person inclined to wrath. And this is the prescription I find most characteristic of her. She recommended pulverizing rose petals together with a smaller quantity of sage. When anger rose in the person, they were to hold the powder to their nostrils. The sage, she explained, would diminish the wrath. The rose would make the person happy. It is a remedy that tells you something about how Hildegard understood the body. Anger was physiological as much as moral, a humoral disturbance, a heating of the blood that needed cooling. The rose was cold. Its fragrance acted on the spirit through the nose, the body's most direct channel to the inner condition. This was not magical thinking, it was applied botany within a coherent theoretical framework. And modern aromatic research has not entirely dismissed the idea that rose fragrance has measurable effects on emotional state. Hildegard also recommended crushed rose hips cooked with honey and strained through cloth for lung complaints, a preparation that is recognizable as a precursor to the rose hip syrups that would be produced industrially during the Second World War, when vitamin C supplies were scarce, and rose hips were harvested from British hedgerows to fill the gap. The medical school at Salerno, flourishing in the 11th and 12th centuries as Europe's first organized medical institution, brought Arabic and classical Greek knowledge into systematic contact with local practice. Its regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum tied rose preparations to the planetary medicine of Venus, prescribing rose conserve for choleric temperaments, those prone to heat, inflammation, and volatility. The cooling, moistening rose balanced the excess. Salernitan physicians developed what they called rosatum protocols, standardized recipes for rose honey, rose vinegar, and rose wine that could be reproduced consistently across different practitioners and locations. This standardization mattered enormously. A sick traveler arriving at any hospital in the Salernitan network could expect to receive a rose preparation prepared to the same method and dosage as anywhere else in the system. Medical reproducibility, achieved through botanical means, 6 centuries before anyone used that word. The rose did not merely grow in the monastery garden. It held the garden together. It was the plant around which the physician organized his knowledge of cooling and astringency, of fragrance and preparation, of comfort offered to the sick and the dying through something small and beautiful. Placed gently in the hands or pressed softly to the face. Let me take down the jar of dried petals from the lower shelf and hold it for a moment while we talk. Rosa gallica officinalis, the apothecary's rose, produced the petals that made the honey of roses, one of the most widely used preparations in European pharmacy from antiquity well into the modern period. The recipe is not complicated, and that is part of why it persisted so long. Fresh or dried petals were combined with honey and allowed to infuse, producing a preserve that was sweet, gently astringent, and pleasantly aromatic. It was prescribed for stomach fluxes, inflammatory heats of the gut, and sore throats. It was given to children. It was offered to the dying. It required no distillation equipment, no specialized knowledge beyond what any reasonably attentive person could acquire in a season's observation of the preparation. In Napoleonic France, the connection between this rose and the apothecary's craft was made literal and public. French pharmacists grew potted specimens of Rosa gallica officinalis at the entrances of their shops. The crimson semi-double flower in its pot said, as plainly as any painted sign, "Here is a place that sells trustworthy herbal remedies, prepared according to established methods, by someone who knows what they are doing." The rose was professional certification displayed in botanical form. The ancient foundations for this use were laid well before the medieval period. Dioscorides, the 1st century Greek physician whose De Materia Medica remained a standard reference for 15 centuries, praised Gallica infusions for digestive disorders. He described the cooling and astringent properties that made rose preparations useful in a range of inflammatory conditions, and his entries established the rose firmly in the Greek pharmacopoeia, alongside better-known medicinal plants. Pliny the Elder, writing around the same period, documented over 30 different preparations using rose, wines, powders, salves, ointments, and tooth powders. Roman military surgeons carried rose preparations for treating wounded soldiers. The astringent tannins in rose petals help slow bleeding and resist infection in ways that practical experience had established long before chemistry could explain the mechanism. The Roman use I find most enjoyable to contemplate is the hangover cure. Petals of Rosa gallica were marinated in wine and consumed the morning after excessive drinking. The astringent tannins were believed to counteract the poisonous quality of vinous excess, to draw out and neutralize what the wine had deposited. Whether this worked in any meaningful pharmacological sense is debatable. That Romans tried it with sufficient conviction to record the practice is not. A gentler but equally practical use was the addition of dried rose petals to laxative or purgative formulas. These remedies, often made from senna, rhubarb root, or alapi, were effective, but harsh in both taste and smell. Adding rose petals served as what apothecaries called a cordial or aromatic correction. The rose did not change the purgative's action, it made the medicine bearable to swallow. This is a small kindness embedded in pharmaceutical practice, and it strikes me as one of the most essentially human things in the history of medicine. In the Indian traditions of Unani and Ayurvedic medicine, the rose petal preparation called Gulkand occupies a position somewhere between medicine and sweetmeat, as many of the best remedies do. The preparation begins with fresh petals of Rosa gallica or related species layered with jaggery, unrefined cane sugar, in a sealed vessel and left in sunlight for several weeks. The gentle heat and the sugar draw out the petals' moisture and aromatic compounds, concentrating their flavonoids and producing a fragrant, dark preserve with a complex, slightly fermented character. In Ayurvedic theory, Gulkand is cooling. It pacifies pitta, the dosha of fire, heat, inflammation, and intensity. It is given for sunstroke, for fevers, for the restlessness of summer, for digestive complaints rooted in excessive heat. At Mughal courts, where the kitchens maintained both culinary and pharmaceutical knowledge at a level of considerable sophistication, Gulkand was a staple preparation. Its concentration of flavonoids, plant compounds with documented anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, made it genuinely useful regardless of whether one accepts the theoretical framework of Pitta that explained it. Let us now go through the preparations themselves, because this is where the apothecary's knowledge lives, not in the general idea of roses as medicinal, but in the specific forms those remedies took across centuries. Rose honey, petals steeped in warm honey, was perhaps the oldest and most universal of the preparations. The honey preserved the petals and extracted their aromatic compounds simultaneously. The resulting honey was used for throat complaints, for minor burns, and as a base for lozenges and electries, soft medicinal confections that dissolve slowly in the mouth. Rose honey also served as a mild mood elevator. The combination of sweetness and fragrance was understood to lift the spirits, and this was not considered a trivial medicinal effect. The ancients and medievals took the treatment of low spirits as seriously as the treatment of physical illness, and often prescribed them together. Rose vinegar, petals infused in good wine vinegar, was a cooling preparation with a specific profile of uses. Applied as a compress to the forehead, it was prescribed for headaches and fevers, the vinegar's cold quality reinforcing the rose's own cooling property in humoral terms. Used as a cosmetic astringent, it was recommended for oily or inflamed skin, tightening the surface and reducing redness. It appeared in household receipt books alongside kitchen recipes, which tells you something about how these preparations were understood, not as professional medicine but as ordinary domestic knowledge, available to any householder who kept a well-stocked still room. Rosicrucianism combined these two preparations into a third. The word comes from the Greek oxes, meaning acid, and meli, meaning honey. Hippocrates described it as early. The formula is elegant in its simplicity, honey and vinegar, combined with rose petals infused through both. The honey contributed demulcent, antimicrobial, and soothing properties. The vinegar contributed astringency, a mild expectorant action, and what the ancients described as its penetrating, cutting quality, the ability to reach and thin, thick mucus lodged in the chest. Together they made a preparation suited to coughs, sore throats, and chest complaints. An 18th century receipt book on my upper shelf records a rose oxymel for dry, irritable coughs, recommending a spoonful dissolved in warm water at bedtime. The instruction has not materially changed in 2,000 years. Plasters made from rose oil blended with wax and medicinal resins were applied to wounds and inflamed tissues. The mild antibacterial phenols in rose petals and the anti-inflammatory tannins worked together, though no one would have described them in those terms, to reduce suppuration and calm the heat of an infected site. These were not considered heroic medicines, they were standard wound management, the kind of preparation any battlefield surgeon or village healer would carry as a matter of course. Among the more aristocratic preparations were the rose noble lozenges, small tablets made from rose petal powder, beaten with refined sugar and ambergris, the waxy aromatic substance secreted by sperm whales and valued in pharmacy as a fixative and aromatic. These lozenges were used for throat relief, but they were also luxury items, their cost placing them beyond most patients' reach. They masked the bitter taste of other medicinal herbs incorporated into the formula, making a necessary remedy into something pleasant and even prestigious to consume. The apothecary who could supply rose noble lozenges was operating at the top of his trade. There is something worth noting in all of this. The rose, from the Roman hangover cure to the aristocrat's lozenge, was never merely a background ingredient. It was always the point. The thing that made the medicine smell like something worth taking, taste like something other than punishment, feel like care rather than correction. Every culture that used it medicinally understood this. The healing properties of the rose were real, but the healing properties of beauty and fragrance in the context of sickness were also real, and the rose provided both simultaneously. That is the apothecary's rose, not the heraldic emblem, not the poet's beloved, not the mystic's ladder to God, just a reliable, fragrant patient plant growing in the physic garden outside, ready to be turned into whatever the sick person needed most. Let us walk further forward in time, into the Renaissance, where the rose did not lose any of its medical authority but gained new company in the form of a physician who was equal parts genius, controversy, and theatrical excess. Paracelsus, born Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim in Funte, which is already a name that suggests something about the man, rejected much of the humoral medicine that had governed European pharmacy for over 1,000 years. He believed that disease had specific causes and required specific remedies, not the generalized balancing of humors. He introduced new chemical preparations, antimony and mercury among them, to European medicine. He was thrown out of cities for his opinions. He was also, without question, the most original medical thinker of his century. And yet Paracelsus kept the rose. He prescribed rose-based elixirs as what he called arcana, secret specific remedies that acted on the body, soul, and spirit simultaneously, going deeper than simple physical treatment against plague and against poisoning. He turned to the rose not as a gentle household remedy, but as a substance capable of harmonizing the disrupted essential nature of the patient. In his theoretical framework, disease was a kind of dissonance, a falling out of accord between the material and the spiritual aspects of the person. The rose, with its beauty and fragrance operating on the spirit through the senses, and its tannins and phenols operating on the body through chemistry, worked at both levels at once. This is not so different from what the monastery herbalists had understood 3 centuries earlier. The vocabulary changed. The theory changed, the rose remained. Renaissance apothecaries distilled Rosa gallica varieties into rose waters of increasing refinement, driven partly by improved distillation equipment and partly by the demands of a nobility and merchant class that wanted luxury preparations as well as medicinal ones. The rose water that came off the still in a well-equipped Renaissance apothecary shop was used to scent gloves, to wash the face, to flavor confectionery, and to clean wounds, all without contradiction, because in the Renaissance mind these uses were not categorically separate. Beauty and health and pleasure were aspects of the same well-ordered life. Nicholas Culpeper, writing his complete herbal in the middle of the 17th century, gave English readers access to herbal knowledge that had previously been confined to those who could read Latin. He described roses as cooling and drying in their humoral character, recommending petal conserves for hot headaches, fevers, and melancholy. His melancholy is worth noting, a condition understood in his time as a cold, dark heaviness of the spirit, sometimes accompanied by physical symptoms, sometimes presenting primarily as emotional flatness or despair. Culpeper's prescription of rose conserve for melancholy is medically interesting. The cooling property he attributed to roses would not, in his humoral framework, seem the obvious treatment for a cold condition like melancholy. But the rose's fragrance was separately understood to lift the spirits, and the pleasantness of the preparation itself was considered therapeutically significant. To eat something sweet and aromatic and beautiful was in itself a form of treatment. Culper was not alone in this. It runs through the entire history of rose medicine. The understanding that the patient's experience of the remedy matters, not merely its pharmacological action. Early colonial Americans carried this knowledge across the Atlantic as practical household wisdom. The apothecary's rose was planted alongside kitchen herbs in dooryard gardens throughout New England, used for teas, salves, and as a flavoring in vinegar and preserves. It was one of the plants that accompanied European settlers as a portable, familiar resource, a piece of the old world's medical knowledge brought intact into the new. In the Islamic medical tradition, rose water occupied a particular and almost unassailable position as what one might call a universal vehicle. The great physician, Al-Razi, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, practicing in the 9th and 10th centuries, recommended rose water compressors for headaches and eye strain, combining its cooling humoral quality with what he understood as its direct effect on the nervous and spiritual faculties. Avicenna, whose canon of medicine remained a standard reference in both Islamic and European medical schools well into the 17th century, classified roses according to their cooling and moistening properties and documented their effects systematically. Rose water was prescribed for digestive conditions, for eye ailments, for what he described as afflictions of the heart, meaning not merely cardiac conditions, but the disturbances of feeling and spirit that resided in his anatomy, in the heart's vicinity. Rose oil was prescribed for skin disorders and for what we would now recognize as anxiety. The 3 major rose-based preparations that classical Islamic medical texts organized and systematized were distinct in character and use. Rose water, produced by distillation, was cooling, penetrating, and suitable for external application and for delicate internal use. Rose confections, sweetened pastes, and preserves were prescribed as heart tonics and nerve remedies used for palpitations, for melancholy, and for the category of agitation that Islamic physicians associated with excess heat in the cardiac region. Rose oils, extracted by enfleurage or infusion into fat, treated the skin and addressed emotional disturbance through direct application and through inhalation. Rose water was simultaneously a medicine, a vehicle for delivering other medicines, and a substance that corrected the smell and taste of preparations, that would otherwise be difficult to administer. In this last role, it performed the same service as the aromatic directions of European pharmacy, turning an unpalatable necessity into something bearable or even pleasant. The Islamic pharmacies of the medieval world exported rosewater across the known world. European crusaders encountered it in the Middle East and brought back both the substance and the taste for it. The damask rose specifically, Rosa Damascena, the rose of Persia and of Bulgaria's Rose Valley, commanded a pharmacological literature that was extensive and serious. Ancient Persian texts described its use for abdominal pain, chest complaints, and menstrual irregularities, and credited it with the capacity to strengthen cardiac vigor. A systematic review of its pharmacological properties, published by researchers from Mashhad University of Medical Sciences, confirms that modern investigation has found genuine basis for many of these traditional applications. Anti-inflammatory, analgesic, antioxidant, antimicrobial, and anxiolytic effects have all been documented in the scientific literature. The rose was not merely beautiful, it was active. In traditional Chinese medicine, rosebuds, called meigiwa, the rose of plum beauty, were prescribed for what the system describes as liver, qi stagnation. This condition presents as emotional tension, irritability, difficulty letting go, premenstrual symptoms, and digestive upset that worsens under stress. The rosebud, in this framework, moves what is stuck. It has an affinity for the liver, for the emotions that the liver governs, and for the interface between emotional and physical health that Chinese medicine treats as a single domain. The petals of Rosa gallica from Provence maintained their official status in the British Pharmacopoeia long after most other rose preparations had been dropped from official medicine. The astringent infusion made from Provence petals survived successive revisions of the Pharmacopoeia because it worked, because the tannins in those petals produced a reproducible and useful astringent effect on inflamed mucous membranes that practitioners continued to find valuable. Official medicine does not keep preparations in the Pharmacopoeia from sentiment. Sappho, called the Rose Queen of all flowers, physicians across 30 centuries agreed, but they agreed on more specific grounds than the poet required. The rose was queen not only in beauty but in utility. The flower that appeared in more preparations served more therapeutic purposes and retained official medical status longer than almost any other plant in the Western Pharmacopoeia. It sits on my shelf still in its various forms, as it has sat on apothecary shelves for 2,500 years, doing what it has always done. There is a particular kind of pleasure peculiar to the apothecary in knowing that a plant gives twice. The rose offers its flowers in early summer, the petals, the fragrance, the oil, the water. And then, when summer is spent and the petals have fallen, it offers the hip. The hip is the fruit of the rose. More precisely, it is a false fruit, a fleshy structure formed, not from the rose's ovary alone, but from the enlarged base of the flower, the hypanthium, which swells and ripens around the true seeds within. When a rose flower finishes, when the petals loosen and drop one by one to the ground, the green nub that remains at the stem begins to swell. Over the weeks of late summer it deepens, from pale green through orange, and into the scarlet or crimson of autumn. That swollen body is the hip, and it is one of the most nutritionally generous things the temperate world produces. Not all roses produce hips of equal quality. Most cultivated garden roses, selected over centuries for the size and fullness of their flowers, have been bred away from vigorous fruit production. The hip of a modern hybrid tea is often small and unremarkable. It is the wild and near-wild roses that give the best hips. Rosa canina, the dog rose, which scrambles through hedgerows across Europe and Western Asia, producing oval hips of deep red that persist on the bare branches through winter. Rosa rugosa, the wrinkled Japanese rose, which tolerates salt spray and poor soil and rewards this tolerance with hips as large as small crabapples. Orange, red, and fleshy. Rosa villosa and other wild shrub roses also produce hips that have been gathered by people for as long as people have lived anywhere near them. What the hip contains has been analyzed with increasing precision by modern science. At least 20 distinct compounds have been identified in rose hips. Flavonoids, tannins, phenolic acids, anthocyanins, carotenoids, terpenes, fatty acids, pectin, and vitamins across several categories. This is a more complex chemical profile than most fruits, and it explains why rose hips have been employed in so many different therapeutic contexts, across so many different medical traditions. A plant with 50 active compounds is not going to be easily exhausted by therapeutic use. The vitamin C content of rose hips is what made them famous in the modern era. But it is worth pausing on the numbers. The vitamin C concentration in a fresh dog rose hip exceeds that found in citrus fruits considerably. The exact figure varies by species, growing conditions, maturity at harvest, and processing. But the gap is not marginal. Fresh rose hips properly harvested and processed represent one of the richest plant sources of ascorbic acid available in the temperate world. They also contain folate, carotenoids, that the body can convert to vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin BY, magnesium, zinc, copper, and an array of bioflavonoids that work alongside the vitamin C. The bioflavonoids improve the body's absorption and use of the ascorbic acid itself. So the two together do more than either would do alone. This is a feature of whole food nutrition that synthetic vitamin C supplements cannot replicate. The full complex of compounds acting together as evolution shaped them to act together, because the animals that ate these fruits and scattered their seeds thrived when they did so. There are practical matters the herbalist must attend to before consuming or preparing rose hips. Inside the fleshy outer layer, packed around the true seeds, are fine hairs. Itching powder, in fact. An itching powder of considerable efficacy. School children across generations discovered this and exploited it vigorously. The hairs are not dangerous, but they are intensely irritating to mucous membranes, and any preparation of rose hip for internal use requires careful deseeding and thorough straining to remove them. The old recipes are insistent on this point. Miss it, and the medicine becomes considerably less welcome than intended. Gathering the hips was, in many temperate countries, an annual countryside activity with a social dimension. Families and children went out to the hedgerows in late autumn, traditionally after the first frost, which converts some of the starches within the hip to sugars and softens the flesh. Cold sweetens the hip. The gathering had an urgency to it. The birds knew what the hips were worth, and a prolonged, mild autumn could mean that the fieldfares and redwings arrived to strip the hedgerows before the human gatherers got there. There was a brief window after the first cold nights and before the birds found the crop, when the hips were their best. People who knew the hedgerows knew when that window opened and went out in it. The therapeutic uses of rose hips in traditional and folk medicine form a list so long that one is tempted to call it comprehensive, meaning they were used for nearly everything. This breadth, which can seem like evidence of undiscriminating enthusiasm, is more plausibly explained by the hip's genuine range of active compounds. When a remedy genuinely works across several body systems, the traditional record tends to show exactly this pattern of broad application. The respiratory uses came first to most people's minds, and they are the uses that made rose hips famous in the 20th century. Traditional practitioners across Europe and Asia prescribed rose hip preparations for colds, bronchitis, coughs, and chest infections generally, as preventives and as treatments both. The high vitamin C content is the obvious explanation, and the obvious explanation is probably largely correct. Vitamin C supports immune function. It supports the integrity of mucous membranes that form the first barrier against respiratory pathogen. People who ate rose hips regularly through the autumn and winter were, in all likelihood, genuinely less vulnerable to respiratory infections than those who did not. But the ethnobotanical record shows uses that go well beyond vitamin C support. Kidney stones appear repeatedly in the traditional literature, alongside general kidney tonics and remedies for the urinary tract. Gallstones and ulcers appear, reflecting an understanding of the hip as a digestive and hepatobiliary medicine. Hypertension, bladder infections, diarrhea, and diabetes are recorded across different folk traditions. Gout and rheumatism appear, and here the modern clinical literature has subsequently provided strong corroboration, because rosehip preparations have now been tested in multiple randomized controlled trials for osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, and the results are genuinely impressive. A meta-analysis examining 3 randomized controlled trials involving 287 patients found that standardized rosehip powder consistently reduced pain scores in arthritis patients, and that patients receiving rosehips were twice as likely to respond as those receiving placebo. The mechanism involves a specific galactolipid unique to rose hips, which has demonstrated anti-inflammatory activity without the gastrointestinal side effects associated with conventional non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The traditional practitioner who gave rosehip preparations for rheumatism was doing something that works. It is pleasing, though not surprising, when this turns out to be the case. The concept of the alterative herb describes preparations that work gradually and broadly, improving overall health rather than targeting a single condition. The traditional herbalist term for this was something like blood purifying, not accurate in the modern biochemical sense, but pointing toward a genuine phenomenon. Certain plant preparations that, taken regularly over time, improve the function of multiple body systems simultaneously. Rose hips were, and are classified this way, as nutritive alteratives, plants that nourish and gradually correct, whose effects accumulate over weeks and months of use. The old convalescence tonics that included rosehip were not sentimental. They were drawing on a real capacity of this fruit to support the body's recovery through comprehensive nutritional supplementation. Rosehip seed oil is a different preparation and deserves separate mention. Cold pressed from the dried seeds within the hip, not from the flesh, but from the seeds themselves. This oil has a quite different character and different applications. It is rich in linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid, the essential fatty acids that the body cannot synthesize and must obtain from diet or application. It also contains vitamin A precursors applied to the skin. It has been used in apothecary records for scars, for stretch marks, for wrinkles, and for conditions of dryness and inflammation, a separate set of uses from the rose petal preparations, addressing the skin directly through topical application of essential fatty acids that support cell membrane integrity and wound repair. This was not folklore operating blind. The science of essential fatty acids in skin healing was not understood until the 20th century. But the observation that this oil helped skin was accurate and preceded the explanation by centuries. Rose hips, then, represent the rose's second gift, the autumn harvest that follows the summer flowering, nutritionally denser in certain respects than the petals, useful in a different register, and persistent through winter on the bare branch when almost everything else has retreated from the cold. The apothecary who stocked rose water and petal conserve for the summer ailments of heat and inflammation, stocked rose hip syrup, and dried hips for the winter ailments of cold, infection, and the particular weariness that long dark months produce in the human body. The rose provided for both seasons. It was, in the most literal sense, a whole year medicine. Let the hips redden in your mind for a moment. Let the hedge stand bare in the November light. The scarlet fruit's heavy on thorn branches. The birds will come in time. But there is time still, and the harvest is good. The rose hip does not belong to any single tradition. It belongs to the temperate world, and to anyone who has ever lived within reach of a thorn shrub bearing red fruit in autumn. That is a great many people across a great many centuries, and the record of what they did with it is correspondingly wide. On the North American continent, the peoples who lived alongside the native prairie rose and its relatives had developed an understanding of the hip that was at once practical and comprehensive. The understanding that comes not from reading about a plant, but from living with it across generations, watching it through its seasons, and testing what it offered. The hips were eaten fresh from the branch when ripe, with a cautious awareness that the inner seeds and their irritating hairs required either careful removal or thorough cooking to be harmless. They were dried for winter stores, cooked into soups and stews, and mixed with other foods for flavor and nutritional density. In Alaska, where winter is long and fresh food scarce, rose hips were sometimes frozen, stored by the cold itself, which northern people understood preserved them better than drying in some circumstances. Frozen hips were eaten through the dark months, and they were also mixed with dried salmon eggs in preparations that combined the hip's acidity and sweetness with preserved protein, a pairing that sounds unexpected until one considers that nutrition was the goal and both ingredients served it well. The Blackfoot incorporated prairie rose hips into pemmican, that concentrated survival food of rendered fat and dried meat, sometimes mixed with dried berries, which could sustain a person through travel and winter and conditions where no fresh food existed. The addition of rose hips to pemmican brought not only flavor but the vitamin C that would otherwise be entirely absent from a preparation of meat and fat. Whether the Blackfoot formulators understood this in terms that would translate to modern nutritional science is less important than the fact that their pemmican worked. People eating it did not develop scurvy. The addition of the hip was not arbitrary. Rose hip teas and decoctions appear across many native traditions for an overlapping set of complaints: rheumatism, colds, sore throats, fevers, indigestion, and kidney ailments. The same preparation that was brewed strong for adult use could be made mild and cooled for infants with throat irritation. Among some groups, the cool tea was dropped directly into the eyes to soothe the inflammation of conjunctivitis. The same cooling, anti-inflammatory application that Islamic physicians had prescribed for rosewater centuries earlier arrived at entirely independently. A cooled astringent liquid applied to an inflamed eye is a solution that crosses cultural boundaries, because inflamed eyes are the same everywhere, and the hip's properties respond to them in the same way regardless of the tradition that reaches for it. The Cahuilla of Southern California ate wild rose hips raw, made them into jelly, brewed hip tea, and used preparations of wild rose root for colds. Evidence of a complete local pharmacopoeia built around a single plant, using different parts for different purposes, roots and fruits and petals, each serving distinct ends. The Cherokee in the woodland east used wild rose roots for respiratory complaints, petals for the eyes and for digestive discomfort, and the whole plant as a ward against malevolent spirits, a protective presence near the home that worked in the medical and the spiritual registers simultaneously without contradiction, because in that framework the two registers were not separate. What happened when European settlers arrived with their own rose varieties, including the Apothecaries rose and the damask, is a story of botanical exchange and adaptation. Plains peoples who had access to both native prairie roses and introduced European varieties found themselves with a wider palette. And there is evidence that some groups experimented with combining preparations, crossing two distinct traditions of use, in the same way that the plants themselves crossed when they grew near each other. The results were hybrid salves and preparations that drew on both inheritances. Across the Atlantic, in Russia, rose hip decoctions occupied a specific and serious place in folk medicine's response to two conditions that recurred through the long winters with considerable force: scurvy and tuberculosis. Scurvy in the modern West is a condition encountered mainly in medical history, but for populations living through Russian winters on diets of stored grain, preserved fish, and root vegetables with no citrus available, and fresh greens unavailable from November through April, it was an annual risk. Rose hips, dried and stored from the autumn harvest, provided the ascorbic acid that kept it at bay. The folk practitioner who prescribed rose hip decoctions for the winter fatigue and joint pain and gum tenderness that preceded frank scurvy was doing effective medicine without knowing the word vitamin. For tuberculosis, the evidence is less direct. Rose hips are not an antimicrobial agent capable of clearing a mycobacterial infection, but the nutritional support they provided to people fighting a chronic disease that depletes the body was real. A malnourished person fighting tuberculosis is less likely to survive it than a well-nourished one. The rose hip decoctions were not a cure, but they were not useless either. And in the absence of antibiotics, they may have tipped some outcomes toward recovery. In Japan, Rosa rugosa, The wrinkled rose, native to the coast of Japan and Northeast Asia, produced hips of exceptional size and quality that were brewed into decoctions for kazi, the Japanese term for the cold and flu complex, and for general winter immunity support. Northern European traditions, including Scandinavian and Baltic folk medicine, independently developed the same use, rose hips preserved as syrups and jellies against the scurvy that could develop in isolated communities during long winters before fresh vegetables became available in spring. That multiple populations across the temperate world arrived independently at essentially the same use of the rose hip is not coincidence. It is the convergence of different observational traditions around a genuinely effective remedy. South American curanderos, the traditional healers of Latin American communities, use wild rose hips in teas for anemia and fatigue. Their emphasis on the iron content, alongside the vitamin C, is pharmacologically sophisticated. Vitamin C enhances the body's absorption of non-hum iron significantly, and combining an iron-rich diet with vitamin C-rich preparations is more effective than consuming iron alone. Whether this was understood explicitly or arrived at empirically through generations of observation, the practice is medically sound. The rose hip's utility has not been confined to human medicine. Powdered rose hips are now added to the feed of horses and dogs as a joint supportive and antioxidant supplement, reflecting exactly the same anti-inflammatory properties that clinical trials have confirmed in human osteoarthritis patients. That the same galactolipids and antioxidant phenolics that reduce joint pain in human beings also benefit other mammals is not surprising. The biochemistry of inflammation does not change much across species. The traditional knowledge that rose hips helped with rheumatism and joint stiffness was accurate for humans. It turns out to be accurate for their animals as well. What contemporary herbal writers have recognized, working from both indigenous North American and Eurasian traditions, is that the rose hip occupies an unusual position. A plant that is at once ordinary food and significant medicine, present in hedgerows and abandoned lots and country lanes, available to anyone who knows to look for it, requiring no prescription and no apothecary's license to gather. The protective qualities attributed to it in folk traditions, for the eyes, the kidneys, the heart, the joints, the immune system, are not the projections of wishful thinking onto an inert berry. They are the accumulated record of accurate observation across many centuries and many cultures, now increasingly corroborated by systematic clinical investigation. The rose gives twice, as I said when we began this section. The flower first in summer's heat, then the fruit through autumn's cooling and winter's cold. The entire arc of the year is held in a single plant. There is something in that completeness worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. There is a particular kind of historical moment when ancient knowledge becomes urgent again, when something that had been quietly understood for centuries is suddenly needed at a national scale, and the hedgerows become a strategic resource. Britain, in the early years of the Second World War, was a country under blockade. The convoys that brought citrus fruit from warmer latitudes, the oranges and lemons on which northern populations had come to depend for their vitamin C, were vulnerable to submarine attack, subject to rationing, and frequently unavailable altogether. The Ministry of Food, which managed Britain's nutritional survival through those years with considerable ingenuity, looked at the problem of vitamin C deficiency and looked at what Britain could grow or gather for itself. The answer was already in the hedgerows, exactly where it had always been. The National Rosehip Collection campaign that followed was, in its way, a remarkable event. The Ministry of Food published official recipes for rosehip syrup, a preparation that anyone with a pot, a straining cloth, and access to a hedgerow could make at home, or contribute to making it an organized collection point. Families were encouraged to forage. Children were especially active in the gathering, turned out into the countryside on autumn weekends to strip the hedgerows of their red fruit. Collection depots were established, and volunteers were paid by the pound for what they brought in. A small payment that gave the exercise the character of both civic duty and supplementary income during years when both were welcome. The syrup produced from these gathered hips was distributed particularly to children and to vulnerable groups. pregnant women, the elderly, those whose diets were most compromised by rationing. It was an explicit nutritional intervention, the government stepping in to ensure that the population received the ascorbic acid that was no longer arriving reliably from overseas. Contemporary accounts were direct about the substitution. Rose hip syrup was replacing oranges and lemons because oranges and lemons were not reliably available. The hip had stepped into a citrus-shaped gap in the national diet. What is striking about this episode, from the perspective of an apothecary who has kept rose hips on his shelves through peaceful decades, is how quickly and successfully the ancient knowledge was reactivated. The understanding that rose hips prevented scurvy, that they carried the quality the body needed to stay sound through a winter without fresh fruit, had never entirely disappeared from folk memory. It lived in the country herbalist practice, in the grandmother's recipe book, in the Scandinavian tradition of rosehip jelly. When the Ministry of Food needed it, it was there to be found. The knowledge had persisted through the centuries in which it was not urgently needed, available for the moment when it was. The collection schemes continued after the war's end and were not officially wound down until around Frischen evidence that rosehip syrup had established itself as an institutionalized health supplement rather than a temporary emergency measure. European pharmacopoeias had kept rose hips in their official listings through at least the IDS, recognizing their vitamin content and their long-standing role in syrups and tonics. The Wartime campaign gave this official recognition a popular counterpart, bringing the rose hip into British households as a daily supplement in a way that the pharmacopoeia listing alone had not. Rose hip syrup continued to be promoted in the post-war years as a supplement for children, pregnant women, and the elderly, the populations whose need for vitamin C was understood to be highest, or whose capacity to meet it through ordinary diet was most uncertain. The syrup itself was simple to describe and simple to make. Hips simmered in water, the liquid strained with care to remove the irritating seed hairs, then preserved with sugar for storage. The ministry recipe was not substantively different from what an apothecary or country herbalist would have recognized centuries earlier. What was new was the scale and the governmental endorsement, not the preparation itself. Today, rose hips persist in the kitchen and the supplement aisle, in forms that would be recognizable to every tradition we have surveyed. In this chapter, teas, jams, jellies, wines, standardized powders, and capsules. Modern preparation echoes ancient practice almost exactly. The dried hip in the tea, the pressed seed oil in the skincare formulation, the standardized powder in the anti-arthritis supplement. These are the same plant offering the same compounds in the same ways. With modern analytical chemistry, now able to explain what every grandmother and apothecary and folk healer and government nutritionist already knew from observation. The rose hip, in the end, is a very old answer to a very persistent question. The question is how to stay well through winter in a world where fresh food is scarce and the body's needs do not diminish with the season. The answer came from the hedgerow, from the scarlet fruit on bare branches, from the knowledge that the rose does not stop providing when the petals fall. The apothecary has always known, or suspected, that what works in practice will eventually be explained by science. The explanation is satisfying when it comes. It confirms what observation had already established, and it adds precision. The identification of which compounds are responsible, by which mechanisms, to what degree. But the confirmation is secondary. The practice came first. Modern pharmacological investigation of rose hips has produced a list of confirmed activities that is, by any measure, extraordinary in its breadth. Antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, anti-obesity, anti-cancer, hepatoprotective, nephroprotective, cardioprotective, neuroprotective. This is not the inventory of a single targeted pharmaceutical, but of a complex botanical preparation acting across multiple body systems through multiple mechanisms. Each of these activities corresponds to a traditional use. The match between what practitioners observed over centuries and what laboratory and clinical research has subsequently confirmed is not perfect in every detail, but the correspondence is close enough to be remarkable. The arthritis work is the most clinically developed. The galactolipid compound known as GOPO, isolated from Rosa canina hips and present in the standardized powder, used in most clinical trials, has demonstrated cartilage protective effects in laboratory models. It inhibits the migration of inflammatory cells into joint tissue, reducing the cascade of inflammation that damages cartilage over time. This is the mechanism that explains what traditional practitioners observed. Rose hip preparations helping with joint pain and stiffness across multiple traditions, in multiple centuries, in human beings and in their animals. The clinical evidence is no longer preliminary. A meta-analysis of 3 randomized controlled trials, the standard by which modern medicine assesses treatment efficacy, found that standardized rose hip powder consistently reduced pain and stiffness in patients with osteoarthritis of the hip and knee, with a meaningful reduction in the use of rescue medication. Patients receiving rose hips were twice as likely to respond as those receiving placebo. These are not marginal effects. They are clinically significant results in a condition that affects a substantial proportion of the aging population and for which conventional treatments carry significant side effect burdens. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, the standard pharmaceutical approach to osteoarthritis pain, are associated with gastrointestinal damage, increased cardiovascular risk, and renal effects with prolonged use. Rose hip preparations, in the trials conducted so far, have not produced these effects. This difference matters. The metabolic findings are newer and are still being refined, but they are suggestive. Systematic reviews of clinical trials report that rose hip preparations can beneficially influence lipid metabolism and glucose regulation, the 2 metabolic domains most central to cardiovascular disease and type 40 diabetes. Some trials found reductions in fasting blood glucose and in glycated hemoglobin, the marker of longer-term blood sugar control, of a magnitude that, in certain comparisons, approached the effects of metformin, the most widely prescribed first-line medication for type 2 diabetes. The reviewers are appropriately cautious about this finding, noting that trial populations and designs vary and that larger trials are needed. The finding is nonetheless striking as a starting point for further investigation. The cardiovascular findings are similarly promising in their direction, if not yet conclusive in their scale. A clinical study in obese, non-diabetic adults found that a daily rose hip preparation lowered total plasma cholesterol and systolic blood pressure by amounts sufficient to estimate approximately a 17% reduction in predicted cardiovascular risk. Other trials found reductions in abdominal fat, body weight, and body mass index, pointing to a role in managing the constellation of factors that constitute metabolic syndrome. Meta-analyses confirm that rose hip powder reduces circulating C-reactive protein, a well-established marker of systemic low-grade inflammation that underlies both cardiovascular disease and metabolic disorder. The prebiotic role of rosehip pectin is a more recent area of investigation that connects traditional understanding to a contemporary framework. Pectin is a soluble fiber, and rosehips contain it in significant quantity. In the gut, pectin acts as a substrate for the beneficial bacterial species that constitute a healthy microbiome, feeding them, supporting their growth, influencing the character of the microbial community in ways that have downstream effects on immune function, inflammation, and metabolic regulation. The traditional classification of rose hips as a tonic for the stomach and the digestion, present across multiple folk traditions, as we have seen, finds here a plausible mechanism. The hip was feeding the gut's beneficial inhabitants, and in doing so was supporting the broad systemic health that a well-functioning gut microbiome underpins. It should be said that modern reviewers are honest about the limitations of the evidence. Trial populations are sometimes small. Trial durations are sometimes short. Preparations are not always standardized in ways that make results directly comparable across studies. The call for larger, longer, better designed trials is not a dismissal of existing findings, but a reasonable scientific request for the kind of evidence that would support confident clinical recommendation. What exists is already enough to confirm that rose hips are not merely nutritious. They are pharmacologically active across a range of systems in ways that are clinically meaningful, safe in the doses studied, and consistent with the cumulative traditional record. The student of herbal medicine, looking at the arc from Dioscorides to the British Pharmacopoeia to the wartime collection schemes to the modern randomized controlled trial, sees a continuous thread of observation confirmed and elaborated, not replaced, not overturned, but explained more precisely at each stage. The rose hip that the Blackfoot added to pemmican, that the Russian folk healer brewed against scurvy, that the Ministry of Food distributed to British children, that the Copenhagen research team tested in osteoarthritis patients. It is the same fruit, offering the same compounds, doing the same work it has always done. The laboratory has given us the words for it. The knowledge itself is much older. The apothecary works with what can be weighed and measured and observed to produce consistent effects. But he is not so credulous as to think that the history of his medicines is only a history of pharmacology. The rose has always meant more than its active compounds, and the meanings it has carried, protective, liminal, spiritually potent, are not irrelevant to understanding how it has moved through human culture. They are, in fact, part of the same story. In English folk belief, the rose near the house was a guardian. To plant roses at the threshold, along the garden path, beneath the windows, by the door, was to establish a line of protection for the family within. The belief was not precisely articulated in most accounts that survive. It did not need to be. Everyone understood that roses near the house helped to keep sickness away, and the rose's reputation for medicinal virtue made this belief coherent in practical terms as well as symbolic ones. A garden full of rose petals and hips provided genuine medicine readily available to the household. The protective symbolism and the practical utility reinforced each other. Dried roses hung inside the home extended this protection into the domestic interior, specifically against witchcraft and ill-wishing. The rose's association with divine feminine power, with Venus and Aphrodite and the Virgin Mary and Isis, gave it an authority that ill-meaning magic was thought to be unable to overcome. Whether one reads this as folk psychology, as the psychological benefit of believing oneself protected, or as something more difficult to categorize, the practice was widespread and persistent. People who believed the roses were working may have been calmer, more confident, less susceptible to the kind of psychosomatic deterioration that genuine anxiety about curses and ill will can produce. The roses may have worked partly through the mind, as many medicines do. The graveyard rose is a different tradition with a different logic. In parts of Europe, roses alongside anemones and other flowers with protective associations were planted at graves to shield the dead from malevolent spirits, and to accompany them safely on whatever journey followed death. The rose's thorns were part of this. They were obstacles to anything that might wish the dead harm, a barbed perimeter around the grave. The flowers were part of it too. Their beauty and fragrance a form of honor, and honor itself a kind of protection. The grave that was tended and planted and respected was a grave whose occupant was remembered and cared for, and in folk belief this memory formed its own protective shield. In Slavic folk traditions, rose hips specifically, the fruit rather than the flower, carried protective power focused particularly on women and children. The red of the hip, the color of blood and vitality, was understood to carry life force that could be transferred to those most in need of it. Romanian customs used rose hips in birth rites, placing them around the mother and newborn to guard against the malevolent forces that were understood to be especially dangerous in the vulnerable period. Immediately after birth, when the boundary between the child's newly arrived life and the world it had come from was still permeable, the red hip was a ward against what might reclaim that life. Placed around the bed at night, Rose hips were thought in later European folk believed to guard against night terrors and harmful spirits, placed under the pillow in recipes that survive in folk magic collections. They were said to ward off nightmares. Here, the logic draws on the rose's association with the heart and with emotional protection, the soothing, centering quality that rose preparations have always been attributed, and that the clinical evidence for roses' anxiolytic and mood-supporting properties now partly explains in pharmacological terms. The person who slept with rose hips under the pillow was surrounded by a scent that was itself mildly calming. Whether one credits the magic or the aromatherapy, the sleeper may have slept more peacefully either way. The association between roses and the liminal, the space between worlds, the threshold between living and dead, runs through European folklore. In ways that are difficult to trace to a single origin, it may derive from the graveyard tradition. It may derive from the rose's association with both love and death, with both ecstatic life and its ending, which runs through so much of the literary and mythological material we have already examined. Ghost stories in the English tradition have a particular fondness for rose gardens. The most famous haunted house in English ghost lore, Borley Rectory in Essex, was surrounded by a rose garden, and the apparitions most frequently reported there, including the spectral figure of a nun, were placed by witnesses among the roses themselves. Whether this reflects genuine paranormal experience or the rose garden's established atmospheric reputation is a question I leave to others. The association was real enough that it shaped what witnesses reported seeing. The rose garden as a thin place, a location where the membrane between ordinary experience and something beyond it is lighter than elsewhere, appears in contemporary folk belief as a natural development of all these older associations. A space traditionally associated with love, death, protection, the divine feminine, the passage between worlds, and the mysteries of alchemy and esoteric symbolism becomes, over time, a space that people approach with a particular quality of attention. That attention itself changes the experience of being in it. Rose gardens are quiet places, they are enclosed, they are fragrant in ways that alter perception subtly. People in them tend to slow down, to become reflective, to notice the particular quality of the light that is not nothing. The Celtic tradition of planting wild roses at Samhain, the autumn festival that acknowledged the year's ending and the ancestors' return, and leaving the hips as offerings for the dead, connects the hips' autumn presence to the seasonal logic of the festival itself. Samhain falls when the hips are at their ripest, red on bare branches, the flower long gone, the offering of something ripe and nourishing at the threshold of winter, at the time when the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest, was a form of care directed across that boundary. The hip was sustenance for the journey, provided by the living for those who had already made it. The rose, in the end, has always been both medicine and meaning. The two were never quite separate. There is a pattern running through the folklore of the rose that the apothecary notices with particular interest because it maps closely onto something he already knows from practice. The rose demands respect. It rewards careful handling. It punishes carelessness, not metaphorically, but with physical consequences that anyone who has reached into a briar uninvited understands immediately. The folklore of caution, taboo, and propitiation that has grown up around the rose across many cultures is in part an encoding of this practical truth in the language of spirits and fairies and guardian powers. When tradition says, approach the rose with care at the right time, with the right attitude, and make your offering before you take, it is saying something true about the plant, even if the mechanism it proposes is mythological rather than botanical. Scottish folk tradition was particularly attentive to the danger of disrespecting the rose at vulnerable moments. The warning against cutting wild rose hedges at dawn, the hour when sleeping fairies are most easily disturbed, carries practical information alongside its supernatural framing. Dawn is the hour when dew is heaviest on the thorns, when the stems are most turgid with moisture, when a blade drawn carelessly through wet wood is most likely to slip. The curse of endless misfortune visited on the careless cutter is folklore's way of saying, this is not the right way to approach this plant. At Beltane, the Celtic May festival that celebrated the return of summer and the opening of the growing season. Scottish Highland custom hung rose hip crosses over the hearth. The crossform made from hips bound together was a protective symbol for the household through the summer months, when Fey mischief was thought to be most active. The hearth is the home center, the source of warmth and the place where food is prepared. To protect the hearth was to protect everything the household depended on. The rose hip, carried over from the previous autumn's harvest, served as the talisman. Bulgarian rose-picking culture has developed its ritual protocols over the centuries, during which the Rose Valley around Kazanlak has been the center of the world's attar production. The rose harvest is a precise operation. The flowers must be picked before the sun has fully risen, because the volatile aromatic compounds begin to dissipate with warmth, and the attar yield from flowers picked even an hour into the morning sun is meaningfully lower than from those gathered at first light. The ritual requirement to leave the first blooms of the harvest unpicked, offered to the Rosa Diva, the rose maiden of local invocation, is superstition in its framing and sound agricultural practice in its effect. The picker who pauses at the first flowers, who begins with attention and care rather than immediately harvesting at maximum speed, handles the remaining blooms more carefully. The offering slows the harvest beginning in a way that improves its overall quality, and the Rosa Diva, invoked at dawn among the flowers, ensures that next year's abundance follows from this year's respectful gathering. This is not bad theology, and it is not bad agronomy. Russian folk belief that cutting wild rose thickets releases the forest spirits dwelling within them is a tradition that makes the cutting of wild rose, which in Russia grows across vast areas of temperate forest, and steppe, a matter requiring negotiation rather than simple harvest. The offering of bread and rose hips left at the edge of the thicket before cutting begins is a transaction. Something is given so that something may be taken. The forest spirits are acknowledged as the true owners of the thicket, and the human gatherer positions himself as a guest rather than a proprietor. This is an attitude toward wild harvest that has ecological wisdom in it, regardless of whether one credits the spirits. Gatherers who think of themselves as guests take less, waste less, and return more often to productive stands than those who think of themselves as owners, extracting a resource. Turkish tradition's warning that children must not eat rose hips alone, lest wild fairy children steal their voices mid-bite, is protective folklore aimed at ensuring that the gathering and eating of hips is a supervised activity. Rose hips, as we have established at some length, require the careful removal of the seeds and their irritating hairs before internal consumption is advisable, particularly for small children. The fairy theft of the voice is the folk narrative for the throat irritation that follows if the hairs are ingested. The warning functions perfectly well whether or not one believes in fairy children. Iranian and Persian traditions surrounding rose cultivation and attar distillation have generated prohibitions that are more esoteric in character. The ban on iron tools near roses during golab distillation, lest the metal anger the flower's jinn guardians, reflects a real sensitivity of certain aromatic compounds to metallic contamination during distillation. Encoded in the language of spiritual precaution, the ban on mirrors near distilleries during rose oil festivals, lest vanity curdle the sacred attar, is a prohibition on the distracted, unfocused attention that fine distillation requires. Attar production demands constant monitoring of temperature, timing, and yield. A distiller whose attention is elsewhere, even pleasantly, even innocuously elsewhere, risks losing a batch that represents the labor of many thousands of hand-picked blooms. The mirror is forbidden because the distiller must not look at himself. He must look at the rose. The Bulgarian practice of tying red threads to the first harvest shears connects the protection of the harvest to the same red thread symbolism found across Eurasian folk tradition. Red as the color that wards off the evil eye and malevolent attention. Red as vitality and life force. The color of the hip itself now applied to the tool that gathers it. The red thread on the shears ensures that what cuts the rose is aligned with the rose's own protective power, rather than opposed to it. The universal folk custom of planting roses at the threshold of a new home and of sharing the first hip tea brewed from those plants among the household's residents, is a founding rite that appears across European and immigrant American traditions in recognizably similar forms. The rose at the threshold is a guardian planted, deliberately acknowledged as such, established at the moment of the household's beginning. The shared tea is the sealing of a compact between the residents and each other, and between the household and the place it occupies. The genius loci, the spirit of the place, is addressed through the rose that is now growing in it. Whether one understands this as literal spirit propitiation or as a ceremony that focuses communal attention on the new beginning and the shared life ahead. The practice serves a real function. Households that begin with shared ritual tend to cohere better than those that do not. One prohibition appears in folk apothecary records across cultures with enough consistency to be worth noting here as we close this survey of the rose's magical life. Never burn rose thorns alone. The thorn, separated from petal and hip, is a dangerous thing in the folklore of multiple traditions. Spiteful, unbalanced, the rose's wound-giving aspect, without its beauty or its gift. To burn thorns alone, without the petal's presence to balance them, is to invoke the rose's harm without its healing. Whether one takes this literally or reads it as a caution about the dangers of the rose's chemistry without its full complexity, the sharp tannic astringency of isolated phenols without the buffering sweetness of the whole preparation, it is, again, good advice in any register. The rose is complete. Take it whole or take it carefully. We arrive near the end of our long survey at a territory the apothecary has always inhabited alongside the magical practitioner, sometimes uneasily, sometimes with more common ground than either party fully acknowledged. The line between a medicinal preparation and a charm was never as clear in practice as it was in theory. And the rose hip offers a final demonstration of this. In contemporary folk magic and witchcraft traditions, the rose hip is classified as a Venusian fruit, associated with the planet of love, beauty, and emotional life, allied with the water element that governs feeling, intuition, and the deeper currents of the heart. This classification follows the same logic as the humoral and astrological medicine of the Renaissance apothecary, who also placed the rose under Venus and used it for the conditions that Venus governed. The tradition is continuous. The vocabulary has changed. The underlying correspondence has not. The hip carries a symbolism that the flower does not, because the hip comes after the flower. The bloom is the moment of love, vivid, fragrant, brief. The hip is what follows, the slow ripening through summer into autumn, the deepening of color, the persistence on the branch through cold and frost. Contemporary folk symbolism reads the hip as the fruit of patience. The symbol of waiting for true love, of enduring affection that outlasts the first intensity of feeling. To eat rose hips or brew them into tea during a period of heartbreak is, in this framework, to take in something that ripened after loss, to consume patience and persistence in a form that the body can receive. The pharmacological dimension of this practice is not entirely separate from its magical one. Rose preparations have consistently been associated with mild anxiolytic and mood-supporting effects in the traditional literature, and the act of preparing a careful tea, gathering the hips, de-seeding them, simmering and straining the liquid, is itself a focused, meditative activity that structures time during periods when grief tends to make time feel structureless. The tea works through the ritual of its preparation as well as through its chemistry. The folk magic practitioner and the ethnobotanist arrive at the same preparation by different routes and with different explanations, and the person drinking it is served by both. Necklaces and bracelets strung from whole dried rose hips appear in folk magic traditions as talismans for attracting love and stabilizing existing relationships. The hip seeds, numerous, tightly packed, protected within the bright outer flesh, make it a natural symbol of fertility and abundance. Greenwich sources describe rose hips as the hedgerow's jewels, bright seed-filled, generous in their yield, persisting through seasons that strip everything else from the branch. A charm made from these jewels carries their qualities into the space it inhabits. The quality of abundance that comes after patience, of seed potential enclosed in protective brightness. The rose hip in ritual baths and infused oils occupies the intersection of magical and cosmetic use that the rose has always inhabited. Rose hip oil, pressed from the seeds, genuinely improves the condition of the skin. Its essential fatty acids support cell membrane repair. Its vitamin precursors support healthy skin function. The person who adds rosehip oil to a self-love ritual is using something that works cosmetically as well as symbolically. The magical intent and the practical effect reinforce each other. Self-love magic performed with an oil that makes the skin feel better is more convincing and therefore more psychologically effective than the same intent performed with something inert. The speculation that early rosaries may have been strung from rosehip beads is one of those historical possibilities that cannot be definitively confirmed, but is impossible to dismiss. The word furosary derives from the Latin furosarium, rose garden, and the rose's deep connection to Marian devotion in medieval Christianity makes a rosehip bead an entirely coherent material for a prayer counting device. Dried rose hips are hard enough to bore and string, fragrant enough to perfume the hands during long prayer, and numerically available in the quantities that the rosary's form requires. Whether the beads were formally adopted or were simply a practical substitute used by those without access to carved wood or bone, the connection between the prayer form and the plant it may be named for is worth sitting with. Spell sachets, potpourri, and incense blends incorporating rose hips are recommended across folk magic sources for love, friendship, peace, and prosperity. The full range of the rose's traditional associations concentrated now in the autumn fruit rather than the summer flower. The hip in the charm bag carries the rose's meaning in a form that persists through winter, that can be stored and used when the flower is long gone. That is in some respects more durable and more practical than the petals that preceded it. The rose gives its medicine and its meaning in both seasons. In summer, the flower, fleeting, brilliant, the thing poets have reached for across 3,000 years, when they wanted to say something about love and beauty and the passing of both. In autumn, the hip, patient, nutritious, red against bare wood, persisting through cold, offering its seeds to next year's growth. The apothecary values both, the folk magician values both. The person who grows roses in a garden or gathers them from hedgerows or keeps a small jar of dried hips on a shelf, they know without necessarily having words for it that the plant is complete, that it gives across the whole year, that it rewards the attention given to it. The magical traditions surrounding the rose hip have never been a single, unified system. They are an accumulation. Layer upon layer of practice from different cultures and centuries, overlapping and sometimes contradicting each other, united mainly by the persistent human intuition that this bright autumn fruit carries more than vitamin C and tannins. Modern occult systems, which attempt to organize folk knowledge into coherent frameworks, give the rose hip a dual planetary assignment. It is Venusian, allied with love, beauty, emotional healing, and the arts of the heart, but it also carries a Jovian character through its associations with health, abundance, and the generous provision of nourishment. Jupiter, in astrological medicine, governs expansion, vitality, and the protection of the body's fundamental vigor. A plant that prevents scurvy, supports the immune system, reduces inflammation, and provides a concentrated dose of nutrients across a nutritional gap, is, in Jovian terms, exactly what Jupiter medicine should do. The rose hip, in this dual assignment, holds both the tenderness of Venus and the robust generosity of Jupiter simultaneously, which is, if one thinks about it, precisely what the best medicine does. Modern practitioners draw on the hip's wartime history, its role in the British rose hip collection schemes, its explicit function as a substitute for citrus, its distribution to children and vulnerable groups through years of shortage, as a layer of symbolic meaning that reinforces the charm's protective intent. To work with rose hips as a vitality charm is to invoke that history, the plant that fed the blood when ordinary sources failed, the hedgerow that stepped in when the convoy didn't arrive, the red fruit that kept children from scurvy through winters of rationing. This is a form of sympathetic magic, with a documented factual basis, which is perhaps the most satisfying kind. Rose petals in love magic have their own long history. Separate from but parallel to the hips traditions, petals under the pillow to induce dreams of a future lover. A practice recorded across European traditions in forms that are remarkably consistent despite geographic separation. Petals in the ritual bath to draw romantic attention, infused in water or oil that carries the rose's fragrance onto the skin. Sachets of dried petals in a drawer or a pocket, maintained as a continuous presence. The petal is immediate, the love that exists. Now, the beauty that is present and vivid and already flowering. The thorn's role in love magic is more cautious, and the folk warnings about it are consistent. Rose thorns appear in binding spells, magic intended to hold something or someone in place, and the consensus across folk traditions is that binding spells done with thorns carry a hazard for the practitioner as well as the subject. The thorn that binds also wounds. The folk warning is perhaps best understood as practical psychology. The impulse to bind another person through magic is usually a sign that something in the relationship requires attention rather than constraint. The thorn's magic is not recommended. The petal's magic is Romani fortune tellers reading the leaf patterns in rose hip. Infusions occupy a tradition that brings together the hip's practical medicinal use, a warm, nourishing tea drunk for health, with the divinatory practice of reading what the steep plant material leaves behind. The patterns in a rose hip infusion foretell romance or betrayal, abundance or disappointment, depending on their arrangement. Whether one credits the divination or not, the reading a rose hip tea is a focused, contemplative practice that structures attention toward questions about love and the future. The questions themselves are often clarifying, regardless of what the leaves say. Appalachian granny magic, the folk healing and protective practice carried into the American mountains by Scottish, Irish, and English settlers and developed into its own distinct tradition across generations. Strings rose hips on red thread for house blessings, hung above doors to draw prosperity and repel ill will. The red thread again, the same protective color found in Bulgarian harvest custom, in Romanian birthrights, in traditions spread across Eurasia and carried by migration into new landscapes. Rose hips on horsehair, hung in barns during storms, serve as anti-lightning charms in some Appalachian records. The rose's protective power extended to the animals and structures that a farm family depended on for survival. In contemporary Druidry, rose hip offerings at Samhain honor the ancestors, the same Samhain connection we have already seen in the Celtic tradition, now formalized into a living spiritual practice. The seeds within the hip, numerous and protected, symbolize enduring legacy. The life that continues through winter's darkness, the potential that survives the year's ending and will germinate again when conditions are right. To offer rose hips to the ancestors at the year's dark turning is to offer them abundance, continuity, and the promise that what they planted will seed forward. Spiritual supply shops across the English-speaking world now stock dried rose hips. Rose haw in the older nomenclature as ingredients for love, friendship, and peace rituals. Burned as incense or drunk as tea during meditation and spell work. They bring the rose's full layered meaning into whatever working they accompany. The contemporary green witch who describes rose hips as hedgerow treasures, things that nourish, beautify, and protect equally at home in teas, syrups, oils, and charms, is accurately describing a plant that has served all these purposes simultaneously for as long as human beings have lived near thorn shrubs in temperate climates. The rose does not distinguish between medicine and magic, neither in the deepest sense does the apothecary. And so we come, at last, to the end of our wandering. We have walked from the Essene forests, where the rose's ancestors first put out their thorn canes, through the gardens of Confucius and the temples of Ishtar, through Sappho's lines and the monastery physic garden, and Avicenna's careful classifications and the Valley of Roses at dawn and the wartime hedgerows of England and the Appalachian barn in the storm. We have sat with the alchemist over his still and the Romani fortune teller over her cup and the Bulgarian picker leaving the first blooms for the Rosa Diva. All of this in a single flower. The fire in my hearth has burned low while we talked. The bundles of dried hips hanging from the rafters have cast their faint, sweet, astringent scent across the room. The same scent they have cast across apothecary rooms for 2,500 years. The preparations on my shelves: rose water, rose honey, rose hip syrup, seed oil pressed clear and golden. Wait for whatever the morning brings. I hope you will not need them urgently. I hope you are already, by now, elsewhere. If sleep has found you, I am glad of it. If you are still here at the edges of wakefulness, let the rose carry you the rest of the way. Let the scent of the distillery at dawn be the last thing you attend to. The mist, the dew, the first light coming up behind the hills, and the pickers moving quietly among the flowers before the sun arrives to take the fragrance away. The rose will still be there in the morning. Everything will still be there in the morning. Rest. Well, you have earned it.